We now come to the motions relating to local government finance, which will be debated together. I call the Minister to move the motion on the local government finance report. Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion, standing in the name of the Deputy Prime Minister, be approved. As you will know, the Deputy Prime Minister and I, like many others in this House, have local government in our blood. We are proud public servants because we know what a difference the sector makes every day to millions of people across this country, and how much strong local government working in genuine partnership with central government can achieve to change lives. And I want to thank the millions of dedicated public servants who work in and for the sector for all their efforts to deliver over 800 services that local people rely on. Now, we know that it's been a difficult few years, but this statement is an important step towards rebuilding the foundations of local government, ready to meet the scale of the challenge ahead so that we can rebuild our country together as part of our plan for change. And that is why I take responsibility to lead the government's work to rebuild the sector with the seriousness and the urgency that, quite frankly, is long overdue. Today, I will set out funding for local authorities in England for the coming year through the final local government finance settlement. But before I do, I want to say the government is grateful to all those who contributed to the consultation in the provisional settlement, which attracted 227 responses, including over 45 from members of this House. Of course, yeah.
I'm extremely grateful for Geoffrey, and I appreciate much of what he's already said about the difficulties and challenges local government faces and the government's recognition of that. He will be well aware that part of the consultation and part of the feedback that he will have had is about those local authorities that have to fund drainage, like South Holland, in my constituency and many others. There is a real problem here because drainage is not adequately funded through the system, and it does require an extra grant, in my judgment, to those local authorities. Will he look at that, and indeed will he meet me and others to discuss it further, should that be helpful?
Can I thank the member for the question and say this is an issue that we are acutely aware of. I think the disproportionate burden that it places on district councils, for small district councils, is quite a challenge. We did meet with representatives from a number of district councils to talk about the internal drainage board levy system, and as an interim measure, because I think in the end we need a more fundamental review of how that's paid for, we have increased the levy grant by £2 million to £5 million. So we are beginning to get there, but I agree entirely, we do need a long-term solution to that, and he has my commitment that we will find a way through that as we begin the wider reforms a bit later on. As the Chancellor said last week, this plan will be achieved first and foremost through growth that is driven by empowered local leaders working in partnership with local communities and local businesses, those who have skin in the game now on the playing field, not confined to the terraces as spectators. But this new approach has to start with strong and empowered local government, because whether we're talking about raising living standards, delivering 1.5 million new homes and vital infrastructure, getting our NHS and social care system back on its feet, or creating good jobs and strong communities, it all comes back to local councils delivering for local communities. Indeed, we can't deliver on the national renewal that working people deserve without grassroots government leading the charge. That means resetting our relationship with local leaders and rebuilding the foundation from scratch. It means ditching the slogans and gimmicks and a determination to get the basics right, delivering decent local services that people can begin to rely on once more. After 14 years of neglect and decline, that's going to be easier said than done, and the scale of the challenge will take more than 6 months to fix. But be clear, we have changed course. The work has begun with determination and with pace. Councils of all political stripes are feeling the strain, and it's going to be a long, hard road to get them back to full fitness. This final settlement marks an important milestone on that journey, as we finally turn the page on chaos, austerity, and 14 long years of managed decline. And in that spirit, this settlement addresses the financial crisis facing councils head-on, moving away from bidding wars for wasteful, competitive funding pots and towards secure, stable, multi-year financial settlements. Of course.
Thank For giving way. This statement is extremely welcome, and in Salford we'll see our core spending increase for 25 to 26 at 8.7%. But whilst this is above the national average, it's still less than the 14% we've had to increase our adult social care budget by to meet higher costs. So does my honourable friend agree with me that the government must move quickly on multi-year settlements and up-to-date assessments of councils' funding needs?
Can I thank the right honourable member for that question, and also pay tribute to Salford's leadership for the work that they're doing in many areas in terms of public sector reform in Salford and across Greater Manchester, because in the end, if all we do is pay at the back end for a system that frankly is broken, we're going to be paying more and more every single year for a system that is delivering worst outcomes for service users. That's bad for service users and it's bad for taxpayers, so we've got to have a more fundamental response to it, and we fully intend to do that. But just coming on to the multi-year settlements, these are essential to make sure that local leaders have the time and the space to plan for their budgets. But we won't stop there. We're introducing a fairer system to give councils the certainty and stability that they need to go from costly crisis management to long-term prevention and the root and branch reform of local public services. Crucially, I can now confirm that core spending power for the sector will be more than £69 billion for 25-26, a 6.8% cash terms increase on this year. And I can confirm that despite some very difficult choices, and there have been choices and trade-offs to make as there always is, this settlement will mean that no local authority will see a reduction in their core spending power. And so, yeah, of course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome this settlement that's seen a reversal of the last 14 years for Hartlepool, where cumulatively we lost £235 million in a decade. This year, additional grant funding is going up by £10 million. That's hugely welcome. However, there remains the problem of council tax as a system in itself. In Hartlepool, if you're in a Band H property, you pay more than £3,000 more than you do if you are here in Westminster. Surely the Minister can agree with me that that is inherently unfair. And will he engage with me and the APPG that I lead to look at solutions to bring fairness to towns like Hartlepool?
I think that there are understandably many criticisms of council tax. It's accepted that it's a fairly regressive tax in terms of the relationship of the ability of the household to pay versus the property value. But in the end, it is a reliable tax, and it's a tax that is understood by both of the taxpaying public. And so the framework of council tax in the way that the framework of business rates will maintain. But that doesn't mean that we can't do more to make it fairer. And I think the best way to make it fair in this settlement is for government to play its part. Because what we've seen over the last 14 years isn't just an acceleration of council tax increases. We found councils are doing that, but they're still finding that they're impoverished. They can't raise enough money locally, whatever they do, to fund local public services because of demand. And what we see very clearly the role of government is to be the equaliser to the system. So taking into account the ability to raise tax at a local level, what does government need to do to provide that top-up to make sure that every area gets decent local public services? And I think in that we can begin to get some fairness into the system. But I take entirely his point, and we will look forward to the work of the APPG. If I give way here.
Thank you very much. I thank the Minister for giving way. I'm just going to take a very brief opportunity to echo the calls for a replacement of the council tax system, something we've been calling for on these benches for years. And please, can the government and will the Minister consider bringing forward plans to reconsider for a more progressive, to retain the power for local councils to decide the levels of taxation, but make it a much more progressive model of taxation?
Well, I can't commit to that today. What I can do is to commit that from a political point of view, the government is willing to work with any party, across party and through APPGs, to really understand the weight of the issue, but also the potential solutions. I'll be honest, though, and say that my expectation that we could get any consensus in this place on a new form of council tax or local property tax is, I think we need to manage expectations, but that doesn't mean we're not willing to listen to arguments. Yeah.
Well, one area of consensus was the Minister's point to my right honourable friend on internal drainage boards, and can I firstly just welcome that he recognises there is an issue in areas like Fenland in the Cambridgeshire Fens. That's a very pertinent point, and I welcome his comments. Could he just take his opportunity, as he is at the dispatch box, to confirm whether any council will be worse off when you take this settlement netted against the additional costs of employer national insurance and the additional costs of their suppliers' national insurance. Because the reports that we have is a number of councils will be worse off. Can you rule that out?
So the approach that we've taken on employer national insurance contributions, which is the £515 million of investment that's come from HMT, has been distributed based on their kind of net service expenditure costs, and we thought that was the fairest way of having an evidence base that could be scrutinised, and so that has gone out to local authorities. Where there has been representations about third-party provider costs, which are legitimate representations and actually in some very critical areas in terms of social care and other places, the difficulty that we have, and we accept the LGA's figures with no reason to dispute them, is that that doesn't mean in itself that that cost will be directly passed on to the local authority in question. Some are bound by contracts. That means that they couldn't pass it on even if they wanted to. There will be local negotiations about the ability of a provider to be able to absorb that cost. But we don't underestimate, and nobody's going to pretend that this settlement fixes the system. What we want to try and do through the settlement is to stabilise the system so that we get to the multi-year settlement with those bigger reforms that really begin to stabilise. I probably need to make some progress with it. Okay.
Just very briefly, because I think, firstly, could I commend him for the constructive way that he addressed that? Because I think what he is saying, but I think it's important to be clear, is as a result of this financial settlement, a number of councils will be worse off. Now, we explained the context of that, but I think the Minister has just confirmed expressly that councils will be worse off as a result of the tax rises the Chancellor has imposed, which this financial settlement do not fully meet.
Correct. Minister.
I think that's true to a point, but we need to take into account, one, the payment that's been made for national insurance contributions for the employers. That goes straight to the council. But also it needs to be taken into the round. So for his own council, the social care grant is £48 million. The social care change grant is £6.7 million. And when it comes to third-party providers, the Market Sustainability and Improvement Fund, his own local authority, is £10 million. And so we are trying to meet the demand in a very complex environment. But as I say, there is no pretending that this is fixing a broken system in one swoop. It's going to take time to do the reforms. I'm going to give way just here and then I'm going to make progress.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and just say I think he's done an absolutely excellent job on behalf of the local government for the settlement he's produced in very difficult circumstances. I think the sector recognises that. Just one caveat, and coming back to the questions about council tax, he said there wouldn't be unanimity. I think there would be a great deal of consensus that if the previous Secretary of State, Michael Gove, thinks the system is regressive, it's probably very regressive. And I hope he's keeping his mind open, and I think he did leave the door ajar a little bit, that at some point we've got to have a review of a system which is based on valuations that are over 30 years old now. It's simply not sustainable for the long term.
I take the points entirely, and I credit him for a lot of the work that was done in his role as chair of the Select Committee over a long period of time in looking at these issues. So I'll take that with the credibility that it's due. Other than to say today we are focusing on the immediacy of our fiscal response to support councils over the current financial year to come. But we do accept that on that kind of long-term structural reforms, whether it's about addressing the ability of a council to raise local tax through business rates and council tax, etc., that all those need to be taken into account, alongside, of course, the cost of delivering public services, and then we bring in issues like the cost of rural service delivery and the rest of it that we are absolutely committed to taking into account. So I'm going to make a bit of progress now, if I can, just very mindful of time, and I think we're guillotined at 7. The budget will deliver over £5 billion of new funding for local services over and above council tax income. So no slogans, no gimmicks. This is real action. It's £5 billion worth of real action. And as part of this, I can confirm today that £20 million more funding will be made available for the Children's Social Care Prevention Grant, putting prevention and reform at the heart of the recovery. And after hearing representations from local councils affected, we can also announce, and I referred to it earlier on, an additional £2 million for support for councils with internal drainage board levy pressures. And this is on top of what was announced in December's provisional settlement, with the grant now being worth £5 million in total. And we'll set aside almost £60 million through the coming financial year to ensure that local leaders have the vital capacity to get their financial house in order. so that councils can be effectively supported to better understand and equally to be held to account for the spending by their electorate as a vital part of the democratic process. And the funding we're providing includes £515 million to help local government with the increase in employer national insurance contributions. Okay.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way. On the specific point of employer national insurance, my understanding is it's not fully being funded by the government. So if I am wrong, I'd be delighted to hear that, because that is something that is really worrying me at the moment, having spoken to my local council. And on that basis, does he not accept that by imposing this extra burden on local authorities, ultimately it's working people that are going to be affected in terms of less public services, less money going into social care and pressure on council tax? Minister.
It's my honest belief, and as I said, and I will continue to say, this is not a perfect settlement, but it is a good settlement. And what we are very keen to do is to make sure that the money goes to local authorities in a way that is transparent, in a way that there is an evidence base that can be scrutinised, because I think councils are sick and tired of the system being manipulated by different governments of different types over different periods in a way that isn't fair. And so this year, I'm going to make progress, but to answer the question directly on the employer national insurance contributions, that is based on service expenditure costs. And the reason for that is because it allows councils to make the decision about whether that's going to cover the in-house provision or whether they will have some contractual pressures further in the system that is showing up in their service expenditure budgets. And so that's the approach that we have taken. And I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies have come out to say that that is a fair way of doing that. So, as I say, there is no perfect way with the time that we've got, but it is a good way, and it gets the money out the door to places that are needed. I'm going to give way for the final time before making some progress.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way, and I would like to commend his approach. I think it's excellent that we've got certainty. It's supporting local councils to make wise budgeting decisions and to invest in all the crucial things which we all want to see in our communities, whether that's more help for vulnerable people. I note the important work on children. Also infrastructure improvements like new cycle lanes, better parks, all valuable contributions to our community. So I do thank him for that.
And I think that's the point, really. You know, when it comes to the fairness in the council tax system, and we have to be honest and say that there has been increasingly an imbalance here where people don't just feel they are paying more and more, but in terms of universal neighbourhood services, quite often for less and less. And I think that's a real danger to the democratic process, where there isn't that link between the tax that people are paying and the quality of public services they're getting in return for it. Because in the end, councils are wrestling with adult social care, children's services and temporary accommodation, and what else can they do but meet that demand? And so it's not a good position for the taxpayer, it's not a good position for local authorities. So we acknowledge all that. Our new £600 million recovery grant targets areas with both the greatest need and the greatest demand for services. The recovery grant is the first meaningful step towards long overdue funding reform, but it is only the first step. A longer-term, more fundamental overhaul of the way that councils are funded is needed to ensure that all councils can deliver for local residents. The Tories committed to improving and updating the way that councils are funded through the Fair Funding Review, but in the end, they failed to make the tough decisions needed to deliver it, just like they failed to give certainty and security so that councils could plan ahead, with a decade marked by year hand-to-mouth settlements. And that's why the 26-27 settlement, which will be the first multi-year settlement in a decade, will introduce an up-to-date assessment of councils' needs and resources, because we are acting where the previous government failed. We will get on with the job of allocating funding fairly based on the evidence of need, because councils know that every pound counts, and they know too that the current system, I want to make some progress through the speech, but if this time I'll give way a bit later on, take more interventions. But they know too that the current system is riddled with inefficiency and is poorly targeted to meet need. It's vital that we get this right, and we want to hear from all parts of the sector to better understand the drivers of need, including deprivation, the ability to raise tax locally, and the impact on service delivery in rural areas. The consultation on these reforms runs until the 12th of February, and we welcome representations from all with a stake in this agenda. We are listening to the sector, and through this settlement responding to the real drivers of costs, especially the spiralling demand in areas like social care, and importantly, we're taking into account the ability of councils to raise funding locally. I'll give way.
I really thank the Minister for giving way. What does he say to residents of the London Borough of Havering who have got a very poor settlement over many decades now, under all governments? We have one of the oldest populations in London and also one of the youngest populations in London. So the settlements never take into account the factors that I've outlined. So will he please look at outer London boroughs? Because it seems to me that all the money goes to inner London and we don't get very much in places like Romford.
I think where we can agree is that we do accept that the old perspective, I suppose, of inner London pressures that don't feature in the outer London boroughs might have held in the past, but it doesn't really address the complexity today where a number of pressures have moved outwards into those outer boroughs, and I think that is accepted and appreciated. But I will say that when I said that this might not be a perfect settlement, but it's a good settlement, for his own council, it is a 6.5% increase in their core spending power. And so there is room there. This is not a flat cash in that sense, and we hope that the local authority will make the decisions. But we're not interested in scoring party political points or picking one council against each other. We know that councils of all political stripes are struggling, and we want to work together through the later reforms that we're looking at as part of the more structural review that we're undertaking, to make sure that genuinely we address that. And so members across the House, when they look at the rationale, when they look at the evidence base, whether they agree or not with the quantum is a separate issue, but at least can say it holds. And that's very much the work that we're undertaking today, and we do encourage members to contribute to that process.
Will the Minister give way?
Yeah, give way.
Thank you very much. I think the point about inner and outer London, the problem is that outer London boroughs are now seeing inner London problems. And I think the funding system, which is archaic, and the formula is based on outdated deprivation statistics, household numbers rather than population, this unfairly impacts boroughs like Redbridge, of which covers my constituency. It's the home to many multi-generational families living under one roof.
We simply can't have interventions. They need to be spontaneous. They shouldn't be read out pre-prepared scripts. Minister.
Can I just make a point?
I think the honourable member has already had long enough. Minister.
I think in a way that there's commonality across the House in terms of recognising that there are very particular problems that really ought to be taken into account when it comes to local government funding. And if it's got right, and our intention is to get it right, it will take into account population, and for those to be up to date. It will take into account deprivation. It should take into account the ability of a local authority to raise that tax locally through council tax or through business rates or fees and charges. It should take into account the cost of delivering services, whether that's about the rental costs of just acquiring space to operate from, or even the cost of delivering services in areas like rural communities, coastal communities, where there are very particular issues. The formula should take that. So let's kind of work through that, and I want to make a bit of progress, and I'll keep him in mind, if that's okay. But when we come to the pressures, this is why we are making £3.7 billion of extra funding available for social care authorities. This includes an uplift of £880 million into the social care grant, and that includes an additional £20 million that I've confirmed today for the new Children's Social Care Prevention Grant, taking the grant's total to £270 million and paving the way for the national rollout of transformed family help and child protection services, as we've doubled settlement investment in preventative children's social care to £500 million next year. Because if we don't reform the system and focus on prevention, we'll continue to pay more and more, too often for worsening outcomes. This is alongside the Education Secretary's work to take forward the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, which will crack down on profiteering and improve child protection, something, honestly, the Tories failed to do, at a very dear cost to taxpayers who were left picking up the bill. Again, the severe pressures on special educational needs, SEND services, came across loud and clear during the consultation. As we've already announced, we're boosting SEND provision and alternative provision by an extra £1 billion to start the return to the system of financial sustainability and to improve outcomes for young people. But we're aware of the impact that the dedicated school grants deficits are having on council finances, which is why we're committed to working with councils, but also parents, teachers and schools to transform SEND provision and the life chances of the children who need it. Good way.
Giving way. I'd just like to raise the issue of Cornwall Council, which is now in debt of £1.3 billion. And I really would ask the Minister what his plans are to address future settlements, which will obviously be affected by very high interest rates on that enormous debt. And the human cost of this is in Camelford, in my constituency, the adult education centre is now closing as a result.
Well, I mean, these are the very real pressures that have built up, and I'm not going to criticise any council from the dispatch box. I think the days of that taking place are long gone. That's not to say that I agree with every decision that individual councils take, or that I wouldn't have chosen a different course. In some cases, the decisions were plainly not in the interest of the local taxpayers. However, we are where we are, and what we need to do is to stabilise the sector this year, reform the funding system over that multi-year settlement so we begin to build back the foundation of sustainability and that long-term security. We need to invest in prevention and reform so we get ahead of the problem instead of paying at the back end for worse outcomes. And in the end, we have to have a funding system that really holds. And by doing that, most councils in most parts of the country will find that they are in a much better position than they were before that work was undertaken. But there will always be, because of the type of decisions that have been taken, the outliers. Whatever system you design, you can accommodate most councils in most circumstances, but you can't accommodate all councils in all circumstances because of the decisions sometimes that have been taken. But there is a commitment, at least from the government, to work alongside councils to try and work through it. And of course, local government reorganisation in some areas will accelerate the need to do that, because we're going to have to reconcile the creation of unitaries and the dealing with then the inherited debt liabilities as part of that. So we're fully kind of sighted on that. I'll give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and can I just put on record my thanks for him, to him for meeting with myself and other Croydon MPs to talk about the legacy of debt in our council and what that's done. But when he talks about early help and prevention, will the funding formula take into account things like youth services, where early help and prevention really can make a massive impact on what councils have to spend over a longer period of time?
I mean, absolutely. In terms of the funding settlement, deprivation is a key part of that. And actually, this is the first settlement in a long time, probably since the area-based grant was in place in 2010-11, where deprivation is a measure by which the government allocate money into the sector. And that is a recognition of that. I would say, though, that if we only see this as a local government problem, we missed the prevention reform agenda that we need to tackle. And another member knows this because we talk about it quite often, but the work that the Home Office is doing on that diversionary activities for young people. I know in many communities, gang activity, child criminal exploitation, knife crime are very real issues that draw too many young people into crime, and we need those diversionary activities in the places where people live. So absolutely we need to address that, and it should be a whole of government agenda, which is why, of course, that we marshal the way that we work now around the government's missions, and it's anchored to the plan for change as a structure for how we approach that. Give way. Yeah.
I thank the Minister for giving way, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the focus on deprivation. I know the Minister has said just now that he doesn't want to criticise the leadership of particular councils, but I wonder if he would praise the leadership of Middlesbrough Council. Mayor Chris Cook has taken the actions that have taken the council out of best value and produced the first growth budget in years, increases in area care and much else. I wonder if you would commend that work.
Yeah. Well, and I think that work was demonstrated by the department being able to remove the best value notice in respect to the work that has taken place there. We know that it's not at the end of the improvement journey, and the council themselves would say that, but what it has are the characteristics of strong civic leadership, and that is on display very clearly. So I appreciate that. It's a lot easier to praise the council from the dispatch box than it is to be a bit more negative in that sense. It's right that when we're considering funding for councils to deliver these kind of vital services, that we also consider taxpayers too. We are committed to keeping taxes on working people as low as possible, and at the same time, we understand the immense pressures that councils are under, which is why we will strike a balance in maintaining the previous government's policy of a main 5% referendum principal threshold, which includes a 3% core principle and a 2% principle for the adult social care precept. We all know that councillors, mayors, police and crime commissioners and councils will take into account the impact on households of increases, and it's right that they do. For the vast majority of councils, these principles and the additional £5 billion of funding that we've announced will be sufficient to support them in setting their budgets. But we know that some councils are in very difficult positions, and we've heard some of that here today. And for some, unique local decisions have impacted on their financial stability. For others, over a decade of mounting pressures has finally caught up. Whatever they do, it's just the reality of where they are. But we are determined to work together to find a way through, including considering requests for additional council tax flexibility from councils seeking exceptional financial support.
Deputy Speaker, and thank the Minister for giving way. In terms of exceptional financial support, my own council, West Berkshire, a small unitary authority, now only has 2% of its net revenue budget in reserves, and has written to the government seeking £16 million of exceptional financial support. And can I, from these benches, urge the Minister to stand with West Berkshire Council and to grant that support so it can continue to deliver those important services?
He certainly has my commitment that we will review the submission that we've had in good faith, and we'll do it in a spirit of partnership. We recognise that the councils that have made exceptional financial support applications have done so at the end of a process, not at the start of it, and they do need the government to work with them, but we'll confirm the exact local authority by local authority allocations a bit later on, but I take on board what he says on that. The financial legacy of the last government has led to a record number of councils asking for additional council tax increases. The ability to request additional increases already existed, but I have to say that there is a need to balance the impact on local taxpayers, and so on that basis we have taken a stricter approach than the previous government. This means avoiding excessively high increases and only agreeing to rises where councils have existing comparatively low levels of local council tax. Having carefully considered requests, we have agreed modest increases in 6 local authorities: in Windsor and Maidenhead, in Birmingham, Bradford, Newham, Somerset and Trafford councils. But this strict approach means that we've not been able to agree to all the requests that we've had in. And it also means that not all requests have been met in full on that same basis. Taxpayers in these areas are still expected to pay less than the average council tax compared to similar councils because of the approach that we have taken. And we have been clear that all councils should take whatever steps are necessary to protect their most vulnerable residents from the impact of additional increases. And at a national level, even with these increases, the overall increase in council tax is not expected to exceed last year's. Now, without the additional £5 billion provided in the budget and the settlement, there is no doubt whatsoever that this would not have been possible. And in a way, that's the new relationship on display. Because unlike the previous government, we won't impoverish councils, nor will we parade them round to be shamed. Instead, we'll work with them to put them back on their feet financially. And that also means fixing the broken local audit system and the unacceptable backlogs that we inherited, moving from a failing, dispersed approach towards a focused, proportionate and value for money local audit office, improving transparency, accountability and confidence in how hard-earned taxpayers' money is being spent. But we all know that there is no quick fix here. The legacy that we've been left is nothing short of scandalous, but this settlement does mark a turning point, back in local government with the long-term funding and certainty that it needs to fix the foundations based on a new partnership with central government and through reform, fairer funding and better stewardship, ensuring that the sector is fit, legal and decent so it can stand on its feet as a strong functioning arm of the state, providing more money for local government, especially in areas of greatest need, like more money for social care, more investment in the things that matter to local communities, from support to our high streets and our town centres, to mending potholes and boosting local planning departments, adding up to public services we can all once again begin to rely on, and stronger communities, supporting a stronger economy with higher growth, delivering higher living standards for working people, felt in every part of the country, driven by a devolution revolution, delivering the greatest transfer of power from Whitehall to our communities in a generation, and finally, putting politics back in the service of working people. This is our plan for change, and it has local government at the heart of it, and I commend it to the House.
The question is the motion on the Local Government Finance Report as on the order paper. Shadow Minister Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I first put on record my admiration for councils, councillors and officers right across the country for the very fine work they do, and that work often carried out at some of the most challenging times against a backdrop of real financial pressures on those local authorities, not least in terms of the rising demand for adult social care, special educational needs, temporary accommodation and others. I don't think there was ever a time when we appreciated councils more than during the COVID crisis. We saw the fine work they did at that point in time and how important it is to have those councillors and councillors helping local people, and indeed to the cost of living crisis also. So can I welcome the extra money provided by this spending review, 6.8% in core spending power increase. I also welcome the approach that the Minister is intending to take in terms of multi-year settlement. I think that's a sensible way forward. And also, I can put on record my respect and admiration for the Minister himself. He always takes a very considered and responsible approach to this, and he has huge knowledge in this particular sector. And I can promise him we'll work cross-party wherever we can in terms of things we do agree on to try and make it easier for local councils to do the fine work that they do. But can I say first... Okay, happy to give way, yeah.
For giving way. He praises councillors quite correctly. Does he think that as we move forward through these changes, it would be not a bad idea to start thinking about how we compensate councillors for the efforts that they make? Many of them give up so many hours of their week and do vital work for very little by way of recompense. And is that something, would you agree with me that we should be looking at that?
Well, as I can only reiterate what he said and what I said earlier, is they do fine work, and most people don't do this for money, of course. They do it because they absolutely have the interests of their local communities at heart, and that should always be the case. That's the kind of councillors we want. But of course, where people have expenses to do their jobs, then that needs to be properly compensated for. Would the Minister accept, though, that the reality is that the majority of the extra monies that provided through this settlement are raised through council tax increases, which are effectively taxes on local taxpayers, of course, working people. And does he regret, because he is sensible and considered, as I say, the fact that the Prime Minister stood on a stage in Swindon on the 30th of March 2023 with the Deputy Prime Minister, his Secretary of State, stating that he would freeze council tax for the first year they were in government. And that has not been the case. He promised quite clearly a tax cut for the 99% for working people who are facing a rise in their council tax. Those were his words. And his words were also there would be not one penny on your council tax, what he actually said. We said then that these promises were not worth the paper they are written on, and how right we were. Under Labour, typical council tax bills are to rise by 5% in April 2025. Another increased tax on working people. This means that the average household faces an above-inflation increase of around £100 to their council tax bills in that year. It's all this we will do, in many cases, is fill the black hole in council finances that Labour are creating due to an increase in the national insurance contributions. Furthermore, it is quite clear that Labour are deliberately funding largely Labour-led urban areas at the expense of rural areas. Happy to give way.
I do thank the Honourable Geoffrey give way. He's one of the more reasonable members of his party's front bench. Not that he needs my praise. Between 2010 and 2024, Stoke-on-Trent City Council had a cumulative loss of £411 million. If cash terms, if the budget had been frozen and no increases, we would have had that much more money to spend. Does the Shadow Minister accept that the damage that his party did in local government cannot simply be fixed in one settlement after 7 months of a Labour government?
As I said before, I spoke of the financial pressures that all councils are under, principally through rising demand on services. That's the reality. This 80% of discretionary spend is on those three areas I referenced earlier. So there is no doubt these are challenging circumstances, but nevertheless, the reality is the vast majority of money raised through this settlement is through council tax, and the reality is much of the money raised through this in core spending power will go on national insurance rises, direct costs but also there are indirect costs that are not covered. Many councils will be worse off as a result of this situation. Yes, of course.
There'll be a response later, obviously, in the debate, but just to be clear, even for rural councils, they will receive a near 6% increase in their core spending power. So it is correct that £600 million through the recovery grant is targeted at deprived communities, but we have followed an assessment of need that has followed right through the system, including rural authorities. You must welcome that, surely.
Well, I will come to that, and we have a different perspective on that, but I say that the point I was making principally right now is there are rising costs on councils, both in terms of direct costs through national insurance and through indirect costs, which are not fully covered by the settlement. And I think he accepted that fact earlier in his remarks. The reality is rural areas will face higher council tax increases to make up for reduced central funding, despite the increases in cost of providing for services in rural areas. To give the House an easy example of this, my local authority, North Yorkshire Council, spend more on school transport than they do on the whole of children's social care. That's the cost of delivering services in rural areas. Despite this, the Labour government has chosen to scrap the Rural Services Delivery Grant. They have said that they are repurposing it. However, it's now clear that it's not being repurposed in a way that supports rural areas in the way the delivery grant used to do, and despite, again, costs being higher there to deliver services. The chairman of the County Council's network has warned that rural areas will lose hundreds of millions of pounds due to Labour's prioritisation of urban areas over rural ones in the way funds are being distributed, moving away in distribution away from a needs-based formula to one based on deprivation. The Chair, Councillor Tim Oliver, has warned that Labour's funding formula will mean that rural councils would lose an estimated £190 million in a single year. He's also stated that when taking into account the monies needed to cover the cost of the national insurance increases, this is the worst settlement for county councils in 4 years. Happy to give away.
Say to the Gentleman, could he just explain his comments there? And I agree with my honourable friend who previously said I think he's one of the more reasonable members on the benches opposite. He said that it's switching money from needs-based to deprivation. Isn't deprivation a very clear evidence of needs in a community? What's the difference?
My point is, of course there are some needs around deprivation, but that's not the entirety. The major cost drivers for local authorities are the things I outlined earlier: adult social care, special educational needs, and temporary accommodation. Now, there may be some crossover, but the reality is simply basing that on deprivation will not work for all authorities. Some will be worse off moving to deprivation from need. Happy to give way.
Thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. I just wanted to hope that we could move away from this pitting area against area, because I can assure him, I am from an urban area with high deprivation, but also very high transport costs for children to get to SEM placements, and also massive temporary accommodation costs. So perhaps moving towards a better model that takes in a whole and around all the issues that we face in all of our areas. We're not fighting each other, we're working together to have better local councils across the country.
Well, I don't want this to be party political, but it's not us who are changing the formula. That's the reality. You are shifting, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's the reality. This is a zero-sum game. If you move the formula around, some councils will be worse off, some will be better off. I want everybody to be treated fairly, but that's a very difficult situation against the current spending round. I'll make a little progress. Now, I'll give them away with 2 months. I'll make a little progress. Their approach is particularly worrying, given their intention to move to a new, fairer funding formula. And fairer to whom, you might ask, relating to that particular point we just made. Labour's promises on this are clear and are broken, and follow similar promises broken on, of course, the fully costed and fully funded manifesto, the family farm tax, the family business tax, the winter fuel allowance, the rise in employers' national insurance, and, of course, that statement, not 1 penny more on your council tax. Happy to give way.
The honourable for giving way. I mean, we were doing so well. We were talking about a fairness across the board and not pitting one against the other. So far, so good. But given his comment, can I just remind him of the words of the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Richmond and Northallerton, in the garden in Tunbridge Wells, when, quoting his time as Chancellor of the Exchequer, quoted having transferred funds deliberately away from the areas in which he was speaking away from the deprived and challenged areas into more affluent ones. So surely, we've got to call out the record correctly, and if we want a fresh start, let's have a fresh start.
I think the Prime Minister was talking, and it wasn't the Prime Minister at the time, he was talking about fairness, and we all believe in fairness. But I think the reality is he'll have a different perspective on fairness to other people, and the reality is there's a political division here. One thing we must agree with, of course, is that the statutory duties on councils should be properly funded. That's the reality, and my concern is that won't be the case, and lots of those pressures fall differently on rural councils compared to urban councils. I'm happy to give way, yeah.
I do thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Under the formula that's been proposed and we will vote on this evening, Stoke-on-Trent City Council will receive a recovery grant of £8.2 million. I hope he's not saying this, but is the Shadow Minister saying that if his party was still in government, we wouldn't receive that additional cash and therefore would be £8.2 million worse off?
It's interesting because the loss of the Rural Service Delivery Grant cost my local authority £14 million. So it depends where you draw the line and where the set of priorities are. That the point being that that has come from a change in the Rural Service Delivery Grant. It's a robbing of Peter to pay Paul. That's the reality. Happy to give way for the last time. That'll make some progress.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. My residents in North Durham, they're in a local authority, County Durham, which is rural and deprived, and I can assure him that the previous version of the formulas wasn't designed to help that kind of rural authority. It may have helped wealthy rural authorities, but it was not helping areas that suffered both from the difficulty of providing services in a rural area and the extreme need caused by deprivation.
Different views on this, of course, and there are many parts of my constituency that are not wealthy, and indeed have deprivation in them, and are not sufficiently catered by some of the formulas in terms of deprivation. That's what we're concerned about. We're keen to see fairness across the board. So we'll be scrutinising Labour's plans very carefully on that basis. The Labour budget promised a big increase in council spending and to return the sector to sustainability through a comprehensive set of measures to support local authorities in England. They've also promised multi-year settlements, as I said earlier, and we support these intentions. However, most of the money provided to local councils, as I said earlier, under this settlement will be through council tax rises for working people. And a number of these rises breach the 5% referendum limit principle. Council tax referendums on council tax rises of up to 9.9% have been waived by the Secretary of State, so local people cannot have a say on these dramatic increases. This means that local residents in Windsor and Maidenhead Borough, Birmingham City Council, Bradford Council, Newham Council are all facing increases of more than 5%. Birmingham, of course, is notable due to the mess that Labour made there, and they're now forcing residents to pay for it rather than taking responsibility. The Liberal Democrats are also raising council tax without allowing Windsor and Maidenhead Borough Council and Somerset Council residents a say on how they feel about the increases. Council tax rises make up the bulk of this settlement, and rather than Labour delivering on their claims to fairly fund local government, they are pushing the burden on to taxpayers. They have also increased that burden with their jobs tax, which will negatively increase costs on local government finance. Although they provided over £515 million to cover the direct costs of employers NI, the Local Government Association has estimated that the National Insurance contribution hike will cost another £1.13 billion for increases being forced upon providers of outsourced services. The cost of these outsourced services will inevitably increase, but the Government is providing no money to cover this. Councils and residents will have to pick up the bill. Council tax receipts in 2025-2026 are forecast to be in the order of £50 billion. Yet Labour's nonsensical Chagos Islands deal is rumoured to cost up to £18 billion. This is the equivalent to a one-off £820 off a typical council tax bill, or would have paid for a council tax freeze for the whole of this Parliament. But as with all things, Labour are wasting taxpayers' money rather than giving them a tax cut. This settlement will make it more difficult for councils to deliver on residents' priorities, be it social care or potholes, which I note Conservative councils have a better record of filling in. It is an undeniable fact that Labour and the Liberal Democrats deliver worse services and charge you more, Madam Deputy Speaker. From Whitehall to your town hall, under Labour, you pay more and you get less.
Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the real terms funding increase in the settlement in the context of a decade of cuts and financial mismanagement. The Minister outlined the additional funding for Children's Social Care Prevention Grant, which will help provide vital services for a number of children in the formative years of their lives. This is really important. And the £660 million recovery grant for places with greater need and demand for services. It's important we continue to focus on prevention to help us not get to a situation where many councils are coming and are asking for that bailout later on. And I'd just like to remind members of everyone of the consequences of what we are seeing with the current situation our councils are facing up and down the country. For some councils, this means the end of the community programmes that keep active people, and means that many people who, for some of them, they go out and they speak to people. I hosted an event earlier last week on loneliness. So many of our constituents are reporting feeling lonely, and those vital community services keep a number of them active. Because of the situation in councils, it means that some children in need of the EHCP plan are not getting that support. And we see some parents and carers having to quit work just to get that adequate provision for their young people. And it means more and more families ending up in completely unsustainable temporary accommodation. And we're hearing stories of families having to travel 3 to 4 hours every day just to get to school and work. And Madam Deputy Speaker, no one should have to go to bed at night not being able to sleep because you are fearing that the accommodation you are in could harm your family. 74 children have had their deaths linked to temporary accommodation in the last 5 years. We are one of the richest countries in the world. This cannot and should not be happening. People rely on our council services for their very well-being, and we need to end the chronic underfunding of these vital services. And we must remember that what we are seeing today is the result of a forced economy of underfunding of local government for over a decade. For years, we've had to see councils cut those vital prevention services just to make ends meet. And the result is that more and more people are now in dire need of those services, which are far more costly, and not just to the local authority, but to the livelihood of the people who need these services. We see this in the private rented sector inspections, in maintaining and repairing our housing stock, in providing the vital youth services that my colleague referenced, which boost the life chances of teenagers and young adults. If we're honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, the tragedy of the last 14 years has seen a more cost prevention and more costly services for our local residents. So the settlement today is a welcome step in the right direction to help councils meet some of the pressures they face. But again, if we're all honest, many of our councils will still struggle to provide the vital services that residents need and deserve. And I'm sure, Madam Deputy Speaker, that many members are eagerly anticipating the start of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee's inquiry on local government finances. And as Chair, I do not want to preempt what we will be discussing over the next few months. But there are a few specific points I do want to raise with the Minister today. And members have raised it, and I know that the Minister has received representation about this. As large councils are big employers, the Minister knows that they will be impacted by the rise in the national insurance contributions, like the Shadow Minister referenced. And he did reference that LGA data, which indicates that even with the additional generous funding outlined by the Minister, councils will still be short by over £100 million to cover the extra cost for directly employed staff. The Minister touched on the service expenditure costs, but there's still a gap that needs to be filled. So is the Minister considering the impact this will have on staffing pressures in our councils? And has the government considered the effect of indirect costs through the commission providers? Madam Deputy Speaker, our councils do not exist in a bubble, and the impact of other government spending areas such as health and welfare will have a drastic effect on the costs that our councils face. And I'm going to come back to an issue that I've raised multiple times, and the Minister will know this, but I do remain concerned about the impact of the freezing of the local housing allowance at a time when we have seen private rents go up by nearly 10%. This could create extra significant burdens on the vital and well thought out homelessness prevention work that our councils do. So I'll ask the Minister, can the government finally confirm today what work they've done to assess this and whether freezing the LHA will impact on families who are struggling with rising rents, and what pressures, unintended maybe, this could cause and place on homelessness service across the countries?
I'm afraid give way. And I thank her for giving way, and she's really raising a very important point about the local housing allowance. When we had this issue before us at the Public Accounts Committee, I think it was pretty obvious that officials had not done any proper assessment of the impact on homelessness of freezing the allowance. That's something that ought to be done. If government takes a major step to freeze an important allowance, it ought to know what impact it's going to have on other services.
I thank my former chair of the Select Committee, and I know that some of the work that the predecessor committee did on this. The reality is we need to build more homes, and the government have an ambitious target on that. But in the interim, our residents need somewhere to live, and that will mean more strain on the private rented sector and more of those rents. So I hope that the Minister, working with officials in other departments, including the DWP, are looking at this real impact. I'd also ask the Minister if he could also inform the House as to when the details about the public health grant for 2025-26. This plays such a vital role in some of the major health inequalities which we all want to see reduced within our respective areas. We're talking about treatment for drug and alcohol services, smoking prevention. I declare an interest as one of the co-chairs of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on HIV and AIDS and sexual health, vital sexual health services, which help to address the inequalities, the health inequalities we see. So it is vital that the councils get funding and certainty on that. Extra money is only part of the solution. Some residents will yet again face higher council tax bill for the next year, and they have the right to scrutinise and ask and make sure that every penny of that has been spent on the right places. But the reality is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that far too often accountability in local government finance is not fit for purpose. The Minister knows, and he referenced this, that the situation got so bad that the National Audit Office refusing to sign off the whole of the government account for the first time ever in November last year. Only 1 in 10 councils submitted reliable data for 2022-23, with over 40% not submitting any data at all. And the Minister outlined the mess that he inherited and the measures they're taking to deal with this backlog. But we must ensure that we do not find ourselves in this position again. The Minister also referenced the Local Audit Office, so can the Minister confirm what additional steps they're going to be taking in the long term to address local government auditing? I know that the consultation just recently closed on the 29th of January. I'd be grateful if the Minister could outline the timeline and when he will come back to the House in terms of outlining the area on that. And I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Minister is someone who shares my desire to give our councils the support and flexibility they need. The first step of this is fixing council finances, and so we welcome the government's commitment to multi-year settlement from 2026-27 to ensure and give our councils that real certainty that they've been lacking for so long. I hope that the Minister and the government will remain open-minded to some of the reforms that we are going to be looking at on the Select Committee, and so that we can all see councils up and down the country delivering effective services that our residents need and deserve.
That spokesperson, Will Forster. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Local government should be the bedrock of our communities. Councils should be empowered to deliver local services, invested infrastructure, and they should be planning to make sure their communities prosper. But instead, years of Conservative mismanagement has left councils across the country on the brink of financial collapse. Nowhere is this clearer than my constituency of Woking. Woking Borough Council is facing debts of over £2 billion. This debt is a direct result of reckless local decisions made by the Conservatives, enabled by a former Conservative government that refused to step in until it was too late. This catastrophic black hole has had devastating consequences to my constituents. And because of this crisis and that Conservative legacy, public services have been, and still continue to be, risked to be stripped back. Community projects are now a second thought, and council tax went up. As Woking's new Member of Parliament, 7 months ago, mind you, I've regularly raised the plight of my council's finances and that of the whole local government system with the Minister and the Department, and I'll continue to do so. I will give way.
On these occasions, I always sit and wait for the Lib Dems to accept some responsibility for the financial mess they created in local government. Now, a 50% cut in grants to local government during the 14 years, the biggest part of that cut came in the coalition government. Isn't it time that he stood up on behalf of his party and apologised for his role in austerity which created this crisis?
More. Intervention. I was about to be nice to the Minister and the team as he intervened, which was quite ironic. But I am very grateful that the government has listened to concerns from distressed councils like mine and others. Unlike the previous government, which imposed higher council tax rises and higher interest rates as a punishment for that bankruptcy, this government has listened, and I'm grateful for the Minister for doing so. And that saved my council alone millions of pounds. And what I found very surprising is the brass neck on the Shadow Minister when he was criticising this government for Labour's tax rises, as he said. The previous government punished my council with a 10% council tax rise because they dared to go bankrupt as a result of Conservative decisions, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have urged the Minister not to impose the same level of council tax rise that the previous government did, and I hope he will do so. Woking, thanks to work of the Liberal Democrats now running the council and amazing council staff, is turning a corner. But I really worry for the future of Woking and other councils like them. The district council network worries as well. And I know the Minister has highlighted that there's no reduction to any local authorities in funding this year. But the DCN says that 0.3% is the average cash increase in core spending power for boroughs and districts. That is not good enough. Those communities, those councils, shape their areas. They protect homeless people. Yet 0.3% core spending power is just not acceptable. Moving on to county councils, the county council network says that 4 in 10 of their members say that they're in a worse position than before the autumn budget and the financial settlement. 1/3 say their service reductions next year will now be severe. Considering there is very little left of the fat to cut, I really worry about those services. My county council, I'll give way.
I will say, and you must accept, that part of the difficulty that we have in a two-tier system is the inability to move money around that two-tier system. And so it's correct to say that the rural councils, mainly in the two-tier areas, have had a near 6% increase. But we have a huge inability to move that money around, and there's around £2 billion in the two-tier system that could be freed up through reorganisation. So will he maybe stop looking both ways on reorganisation and give his commitment on his behalf of his party that they will support reorganisation of local government?
Thank the Minister for admitting that the 0.3% rise in DCN funding is what is happening. I don't think you could say the Liberal Democrats and I are looking both ways on neutralisation based on the previous statement we had and the questions that took this debate longer than maybe members wanted. We have concerns with neutralisation, particularly the way you're doing it, but fundamentally reforming local government is something we welcome. But you can't impose it on councils and local areas, and we are concerned that that is happening. My county council, Madam Deputy Speaker, Surrey County Council, has got 14 days left of reserves. That is how bad the state of the finance is. And I know the Minister talks about the last 14 years. I am more worried about the 14 days until my local authority that is protecting vulnerable elderly people and children will run out of money. Social care is another area where the previous government failed miserably, and Labour, I do worry, sets to repeat the same mistakes again. Councils provide social care are supposed to be better off under this statement, but the reality is the demand for care is rising, costs are soaring, and local authorities are still struggling to meet their legal needs, as I'm sure all members will receive on their casework and we see time and time again in tribunals. The government's allocation of funding to social care is simply not enough. The government's refusal to commit to long-term reform and particularly have a long-term inquiry is going to make this problem worse, not better. On top of that, local authorities are saddled with extra costs from the government's own policies. The increases in national insurance contributions will push up payroll costs for councils across the country. Yes, yet the government's package of support is lacking. And that fall means hundreds of millions of pounds councils will be short of, just from the NI in contributions. That means all councils will once again be pushed to increase council tax or cut services. The Liberal Democrats and I are really concerned that rural councils will suffer as a result of the government's decision to remove the Rural Services Delivery Grant in favour of the new Recovery Grant. This new grant will be allocated through a need and demand basis, where we are concerned that this will exclude rural councils from critical funding because it does not consider the specific reasons why the delivery of services is more expensive in rural areas. I will give way.
I do thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Stoke-on-Trent will get £8 million out of the recovery grant. We are the 5th poorest city in the country. He and I both want to see the services in our communities funded. So I would urge him not to fall into the false trap the Conservatives are setting by trying to pit our councils against one another, because actually I want services, he wants services. We just need to agree to fund them properly and not be put into some sort of Hunger Games competition.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to thank the honourable member for his helpful contribution. We shouldn't have councils competing against each other, but the concern we have is that, yes, you need to recognise deprivation, you need to support and local government funding should be linked to that, but you also have to recognise the cost of delivery of services, and that is our fear that removing the Rural Services Grant will do that. Last year, the Rural Service Delivery Grant provided £110 million to rural councils to compensate for that vast rural areas that they serve. And that means they're going to have to face higher costs. So we are very concerned about that. And it will leave rural communities and rural residents struggling with less services and higher tax again. The Liberal Democrats urge the government to provide rural councils with the funding settlement they need. I will then, let's try to bring this to a close. The Liberal Democrats believe in properly funding local government so that we can care for the people that we need to be cared for, house the people we need to house, and protect the vulnerable residents. I do want to thank the Minister and his officials for putting together this funding settlement. It is a step in the right direction. It is an improvement on what we've seen, but I think the Minister will even concede it can't not be. It was always going to be better. But it is a step in the right direction, but the challenges, the challenges, it's almost complete. The challenges we face as a society and as a country are so huge, and the Liberal Democrats and I need to hold this government to account to make sure that this is the last 1 year single financial settlement. We need to make sure that social care is properly funded. That doesn't mean kicking the can down the road in 3 years' time. That means the homeless strategy that we promised in July genuinely solves the problem, genuinely tackles prevention and is fully funded. I need to mention special educational needs as well. We need to tackle that issue on a long-term cross-party basis, not kick the can down on the road. And that is the fear that those issues will continue to do so. I was very pleased that the Minister agreed and almost conceded to have a cross-party review into the council tax system. The fact that we had the Honourable Member for Hartlepool highlighting that his constituents in a Band H property are charged £3,000 more than a property in London isn't acceptable. It's quite well known that Buckingham Palace pays the same level of council tax that an average 3-bedroom semi-detached does in Blackpool. That isn't reasonable. We need to fundamentally tackle those issues. The Liberal Democrats and I are immensely grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the councillors and council staff that give up their time and their lives to shape their communities. Yeah. But we cannot let them down in this House, and they need to be fully funded going forward. Thank you.
Yeah. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to say it's one of the first occasions for many, many years where in speaking this debate, I don't have to stand up and say how badly Sheffield's been treated, because we've got a fair settlement for the first time for the 14 years. Sheffield's a well-run council, and I congratulate Councillor Ton Hunt, the leader of the council, and Kate Josephs, chief exec. We're not at the financial cliff edge. This settlement will not resolve all the problems and difficulties the council has, but it does mean that that cliff edge is a bit further away, and they've got a bit of room now to look at, take serious decisions about resource allocation and trying to continue with, and in some cases, hopefully improve some of the services. Yes, as a council in this settlement, Sheffield has received £16.5 million from the recovery grant. That's right, because we've lost out in so many settlements because we're a deprived community, and it's deprived communities which had the biggest cuts of all during the years of austerity. That is the reality. And we have 60% of the properties only on Band A. So you put the council tax up and it doesn't bring in the same amounts of money it does in more affluent areas. So it's right the government has recognised that. Yes, we've got an increase in social care and homelessness provision, the grants for those. That's welcome, though I have to add the caveat. The council is saying to me that still doesn't cover the increased costs in those two areas that they're facing, and indeed the national insurance increase haven't been totally compensated for by government. So there are some challenges and issues in the settlement. It's not 100%, but it's an awful lot better than where we've been previously, and that's what we've got to remember. But I'm sure the Minister recognises that this is the easy year, isn't it? We come on to the real challenges next year with the longer-term settlement. A 3-year settlement, absolutely right. Fair funding to be looked at, absolutely right. You can't carry on. I mean, the previous government were going to do a fair funding deal 10 years ago. They never got round to implementing it. So clearly what is needed is just a question now of getting on and doing it. And we recognise that's an absolutely massive challenge. But I'll just say to the Minister, my honourable friend, if we're going to get that settlement right for the 3 years, we've got to address the issues of children's social care, of SEND provision, and of homelessness, and the fight for temporary accommodation between different government departments, which drives the costs up. Those issues need resolution. We also need a resolution to adult social care, though I understand that may not come for a couple of years afterwards, but if we can at least sort the other issues out, it will be a significant step forward. Just raise 3 other issues very briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I appreciate the shortage of time. From the next financial year, the Public Accounts Committee, I see the chairman over there probably will recognise this. We've been told very clearly by the Treasury that from next year, departments must not use money allocated for capital projects to be spent on revenue. Yeah. Now, the way that local government's been bailed out, where it's had to be bailed out in the last few years, is by capitalising revenue expenditure. So what happens if the Treasury puts a lockdown on that activity? I don't know whether there's been any thought to that. It's something clearly that I think does need some thinking about. Public health, my friend, the chair of the Select Committee mentioned this. Why is it late once again, the grant? It's probably not the Minister's responsibility, I accept it, but he referred to prevention as being really important, and it is, and that's exactly what public health is about. So can we, from next year at least, get the public health grant at the same time as the local government grant? And finally, look, I echo the comments about the hard work of local government staff and councillors in particular. Councillors, many of them lose money, and there is a real challenge about getting younger people to become councillors. I asked the Secretary of State earlier, but she didn't respond directly to my question. When are the government going to look at reinstating the right for councillors to join the local government pension scheme. For many younger councillors, that's a real difficulty. They come in, they lose money, but they also lose their pension in the longer term as well. Just on that point, yeah.
I thank him, and I declare an interest as someone who did serve as a local councillor, like many other colleagues in this House, and not just in terms of the pension, but the additional costs that younger councillors are probably facing now. Going in and serving your local community may seem off-putting. Then you add on top the level of abuse that local councillors are facing for doing that public duty. Does he not think that this is something that the government should definitely be looking at?
Yes, I do, and I think it's good that actually arrangements are being put in place for the police now to give more protection to councillors in that particular space, and I think that's welcome, but certainly recognising, particularly for younger councillors, the financial strains. I ask the Minister, it's not a lot, it doesn't take a lot of money. Please allow that to happen. Finally, I must say, I forgot at the beginning, Madam Speaker, to declare my interest as Vice President of the Local Government Association. I'm sure they're pleased with the settlement. Thank the Minister for the settlement. He'll recognise the challenges I think that have been outlined. They're there to be faced for future years, but thank you for this settlement today.
Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm very pleased to follow my very hard-working, excellent deputy on the Public Accounts Committee, who, of course, has huge knowledge on local government matters. In fact, whenever we come in the Public Accounts Committee to local government matters, we always defer to the Honourable Member for Sheffield South East. And I echo the opening remarks by the Honourable Member for Thirsk and Malton on the front bench about our hard-working councillors up and down the country, whatever political persuasion they are. They often work many hours and they don't get very much pay for it, and so they do it because they want to improve the lot of their local communities. So I do actually warmly welcome that. And actually, even his opening remarks to the local government minister, who's I always think a fair and reasonable man. So, and I think he's dealt with this in a very knowledgeable and professional way this afternoon, so I pay tribute to him for that. I'd also like to pick up just a couple of things from the excellent speech of the chairman of the Local Government Committee. Two things, and she did make an excellent speech, and she obviously is very knowledgeable on this whole matter. Two things I'd like to pick up, which have already been picked up by others, but one was the local health grant. And, you know, it's peanuts in comparison with the total health budget. But actually, if we could keep the population more healthy through the things that she said and many other preventative measures, it would be far better for them and far cheaper for the country in the longer run. So I don't know why governments of all colours haven't paid more attention to this. I'd also like to pick up the point that actually the member for Sheffield South East picked up, and that's local housing allowances. And it's, as my deputy said, it's not really being calculated, the impact on this on homelessness, as our PAC report made perfectly clear. And I think the local government minister needs to look at that and just see what the relationship is and how we can get a closer, more targeted local housing allowance or some other allowance to actually alleviate the problem of some of the poorest in our society that can't actually afford the houses that they live in, and they have to be subsidised to a considerable extent by their local authority, putting even more pressure on their local authority. So local government is not often understood by our constituents, but they certainly know when they're not getting the services they pay for from their council. Council tax bills are increasing up and down the country. And I was shocked to read that some people's council tax are going up by as much as 10%, as the Secretary of State is given permission to override the legislation in place for a referendum to be called if council tax is raised more than 5%. And I might remind the House, as my honourable friend from the front bench did, the Prime Minister did state in Bristol that he would freeze council tax bill for all, and this has clearly not been the case. I mean, I would love it if he was able to, but clearly when he said it, it wasn't realistic. The Public Accounts Committee, which I have the great honour to chair, Madam Deputy Speaker, on behalf of this House to try and expose how the taxpayer's pound is spent well or not, as the case may be, has taken a strong interest in local government, and we will shine a light on those areas that need to be shone, as indeed will the chairman of the Local Government Committee, and combined together, hopefully we can make a real difference and a positive difference in the way services are delivered for the people up and down this country. It is clear that local government finances have been increasingly become more dependent on council tax rather than central government grants. And but it cannot be denied, and I listened to the speech from the Liberal Democrat spokesman about his local council, but it cannot be denied that some councils have managed their budgets better than others. And I would like to go on and welcome the multi-year settlements that this government has introduced. We often criticise the government, but it is in this case something that I think is warmly welcomed by councils, and I think it would be welcomed by other areas of government spending too. Because, like a business, local authorities will be able to plan investing the taxpayers' money into longer-term projects with more certainty and therefore hopefully using money more efficiently. I would like to urge the government in their review of the funding formula to keep in mind the rural-urban divide, and we've had quite a lot of discussion about it this evening, and I don't in any way wish in what I'm going to say to pit one council against another. That's not the object of what I'm saying, but I'm simply saying if you put the emphasis more on one facet rather and less on the other, you're going to actually benefit some councils and disadvantage other councils. And the problem with rural councils is that it actually costs, in many cases, more to deliver services, and it's not properly reflected in the grant. And even the library say that scrapping of the rural service grants and replacing it with a recovery grant already demonstrates a divide. And according to the House of Commons Library, who are supposed to be independent, the change in methodology of allocating money has meant that rural areas are losing out to urban and city centres by this change. Now, I don't want to get into heavy water, but a need is a need. So the needs that has already been mentioned today of children's social services and adult social services, both very high consuming part of the voluntary part of the budget, are increasing. And if you take away the needs basis and you put it into deprivation basis, you are going to benefit some councils and you are going to disadvantage other councils. And as I say, I repeat, a need is a need. Adult social services, children's social services, SEND, which our committee did a report on, said the system is broken, is a hugely consuming part of the budget, and it's consuming a greater and greater percentage. Just a second. Another part of the budget that's consuming more and more of the budget is the temporary housing accommodation. And this, again, needs a fix in some way or another, because we cannot let structurally these areas of spending go on unreformed so that actually it just puts huge pressure on the finances of all councils. I give way to a former member of the Public Accounts Committee.
I do thank the right honourable gentleman. The honourable gentleman for giving way. And I did enjoy our time on the Public Accounts Committee. For 2 years I led a small shire district council. We were often told then that there would be money for county councils because that's where the greatest need was in terms of adult social care, children's social care and various other demand-led services. So I don't even think the divide is urban-rural. It can sometimes be in the same locality between county and district. So is this his quiet way of telling us that when my friend brings forward the orders for reorganisation, his party will be supporting that to take out that one element of potential divide in our funding systems?
Actually, I'm really pleased the honourable gentleman has raised the whole business of devolution, and I am going to come on to that at the end of my speech. But what I think we should do is build it from the bottom up as we did, and let local people have a real say in what they want for the future of their delivery of local services. But I'm going to say a little bit more about that and ask the local government minister some quiet questions at the end about it. Now, I want to come on to a matter that is bread and butter to the Public Accounts Committee, and the Honourable Lady, the Chairman of the Local Government Committee, did raise this whole subject, and this is the whole business of local auditing. And without proper auditing, there is no guarantee that all the money that these councils, I say all the money that these councils are getting from both council tax and from local government grants in one form or another is being spent wisely and giving value for money. So the shocking position that we find ourselves in with local auditing at the moment, I think is not helping the whole system. And the Public Accounts Committee recently held an evidence session on the whole of government accounts, as the Honourable Lady did refer to, and we found that 44% of councils did not submit any data at all to those whole of government accounts, and 46% of the accounts hadn't been audited for nearly 5 years in some councils' cases. Now, the local government minister has laid before the House measures to ameliorate the timing of producing local audits, and hopefully we can get into a situation where we can start those local audits, get a set of figures that we can begin to rely on, and then the next year, once you've started with an established set of figures, you hopefully ought to be able to get a properly audited set of accounts. And I will just in a second, but I want to make to the local government minister a really important point as to why all this matters. And why does it matter? Because if you don't have a properly set of audited accounts, not only do you know that the money you're spending, you haven't got a really sound basis to know what money you're spending on. As the local government minister knows only too well, it isn't only the audited accounts that's important, it's the assurance that goes with those audited accounts, so that council officers, councillors, the public, the council taxpayers, begin to get an idea if something is going wrong with their council. And I would say to him gently that if more councils knew that, we might not run into a situation where all the councils that have issued a Section 114 notices, and however you cut the cake, when a Section 114 comes into effect, the government send in officials to run that council, it always ends up in local people getting a poorer service, they're having their services cut, and it ends up being more expensive in council tax. So it's a really bad situation when a council gets into that situation, and that's why we need proper audited accounts. I give way to the local government minister.
I'm only intervening given his position as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, just to say I do think this is a common interest from the Public Accounts Committee, Parliament and government, where, not without kind of labouring in the past. The point now is how do we move forward? And from our perspective, it is not acceptable at all that the whole of government's accounts can't be reconciled because of local government audit backlogs. So we want to address that. But more importantly, and this is where there's definitely a common interest, we've got to rebuild that early warning system back into the system, because what we can't pick up at the moment, effectively enough, is are there systemic problems in the system that is more than just one council beginning to wobble that we should be aware of and take action on?
The local government minister must be a clairvoyant and he must be reading my notes. So, I warmly welcome the government's consultation on local audit reform, which would establish a statutory and independent local audit office, and it would be responsible for coordination of the system, provide quality oversight and reporting that is currently missing. And it's even talking about setting up some form of backstop public auditing system. So there's a lot of reforms in there that are being consulted on that I think the government is to be warmly welcomed and congratulated on tackling this subject. And I really hope, as chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, that the local government minister and the government will succeed in this quest, because I think if we do, it will begin to make local government much more efficient. And we haven't talked much about efficiency today, but it is really common across public services that if we can improve the efficiency, we really are making our taxpayers' money going further. Because the consultation says, and this is the core of the matter, with just 1% of councils and other local bodies publishing audited accounts on time last year, and a backlog of nearly 1,000 accounts, dating back to some, as I said, 5 years, 2015-16, demonstrated that real reform is needed and quickly. So I think we are in total agreement. We will go on examining this matter and pushing the government to see how we can do this. So I'd now like to move on for a few remarks on my own Gloucestershire County Council. And firstly, I'd like to pay tribute to the Chief Executive, Pete Bungard, who's run the council for 27 years. And as I say in a minute, it's been pretty well run financially. And to Councillor, the leader, Councillor Mark Hawthorne, no longer the leader, but the retiring leader, who's led the council so well. They will both be sorely missed. It is under such constant leadership that I believe Gloucestershire County Council is in a very strong financial position today. Under a Conservative-led council, they are one of the few councils not raising their council tax to the full 5%, only raising it by 2.99%. This means that, based on a Band D property, residents will only pay an additional £6.65 each month, which I think is a very creditable performance. I'm also pleased that Gloucestershire is on track to invest an additional £32.7 million in local services in critical areas for its residents. And this includes a £10 million going towards road improvements, with a focus on rural roads as a part of a £100 million four-year programme in Gloucestershire. The Public Accounts Committee recently focused it on the Commission of Local Roads, and over £1 billion a year is spent towards that. But the Department of Transport admitted, and I think this is something we really need to concentrate on, they did not know exactly how local authorities spent this money, as it is not ring-fenced. And I think, as a lot of areas of government, we need better data on how councils are spending this money to make sure that we are getting better maintenance of our roads and actually avoiding some of the potholes. And this is an issue, I'm sure, for all members of Parliament, that their post bags, and whenever they knock on the door, everybody raises potholes. I'm also pleased that Gloucester County Council will be investing £12.8 million in a 200-place special school for Gloucestershire. Sending special needs children out of county, is one of the most expensive items that any council has to undertake. And so I think that actually building our own facility in Gloucestershire in the longer term will be good value for money. And the Public Accounts Committee, as I've already referred to, did do an inquiry into special needs. And we reported that really the system is broken. And it comes back to my point earlier. Just spending more and more money when the structural needs to change is not the answer. And it doesn't matter whether it's special need, children's social services, mental health, adult social services. It's just not the answer. We need to have a longer-term structural reform, and I hope maybe we might see some proposals from this government to do that. And at SEN, we found out in the last 10 years, has doubled in cost, but we're not getting double the service for it. So that really demonstrates well and truly that the system is broken. I would also like to just finally finish with what the Honourable Gentleman, my former colleague on the Local Public Accounts Committee, raised. And we've heard a statement this afternoon, and as I said to the Secretary of State, the Deputy Prime Minister, people in Gloucestershire will welcome the fact that they've now got certainty that our elections will take place this year. That means there will be a new county council elected. So I would like to ask the local government minister if he can give any idea, as I asked his boss, the Deputy Secretary, a timetable of how he expects my council to move towards devolution. And I'm not against devolution at all. But what I would say loud and clear in that timetable, I would like adequate time for a wide consultation to take place in Gloucestershire so that we could have the wholesale backing of the people of Gloucestershire as to what they really want, their structures for their delivery of local government services in the future. Because if they have bought into it, it means that they will be much happier with any change that might take place. So that timetable would be really welcome if we could have that either tonight or sometime in the relatively near future. And with the timetable, if you could say how a transition might work in Gloucestershire, will that new council stay in place for 4 years, albeit perhaps towards the end of the 4 years shadowing a new unitary authority, so that we don't have elections again within the 4 year cycle, would be really helpful information. I'll give way to the local government minister.
On the timetable point, so all councils will receive their statutory invitations in the 21 two-tier areas for reorganisation. It's for individual councils' areas to decide whether they want to apply to that process or not. If they do choose to apply, then we would expect proposals to be submitted to government by November. So it's quite a short time period in terms of working up those proposals, but there will be support in terms of capacity along that route. In terms of how that unlocks devolution a bit further down the line, we're obviously concentrated on the devolution priority programme at the moment and getting those landed and getting the mayors in place, but the door is always open to areas that want to talk about mayoral devolution.
The local government sort of partly answered the question, but he did say it was a very short time having received that letter, I understand we'll get the letter very shortly, that's great. But then, how long a time will it be for the County Council to work up a proposal that might be acceptable to the government? Because that's what they will want to know. And I would request earnestly in that timetable that we do have enough time to be able to consult people as widely as possible for the reasons that I've just said. And also, if you could tell us, he'll write to me, that would be really helpful, and put a letter in the library so everybody else would benefit. And also about whether the newly elected County Council will be in place for 4 years or not. That's really helpful. Well, I have to say that I think this has been a very constructive debate, as is the case often, Madam Deputy Speaker, when there are relatively few people in the House, and we get a subject like this that we can both all sides can get their teeth into, come up with some constructive proposals on behalf of our constituents, which is what we are here for, then I think we really are achieving something. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for allowing me to catch your eye in this debate.
Sean Davies.
Speaker, first can I declare my interest as a serving unpaid councillor at Clifton-Brown Council and also an honorary Vice President of the Local Government Association. I want to start by welcoming the local government's finance statement, and in particular the real terms funding increase of 4.3% for local authorities across England. I am particularly pleased to see the £16.5 million extra funding for Clifton-Brown Council, a 9% uplift. And what a contrast, Madam Deputy Speaker, with the last 14 years of the Conservative government, during which authorities were, in the words of the Institute for Government, hollowed out by austerity, with core funding per resident falling by 18% during that time. And we've all felt it in our communities. A third of English libraries closed during the 2010s. The number of miles covered by bus routes fell by 14%, and the proportion of council budgets coming from council tax rose from 36% in 2010 to 53% today, hitting working people hard in the pocket. And I have to say to the honourable member representing the Conservative Party that it's a bit rich to talk about council tax rises when over the last 10 years council tax doubled under the last Conservative government. But this statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a vital first step, and I emphasise the word first, in the right direction. But we've been saying as a sector, and as myself as the Chair of the Local Government Association, that authorities, yes, need more funding, but they also need reform and a focus on prevention. Because local government is the best preventative service this country has. When it comes to housing of vulnerable children and adults, it's local authorities and local government that provide that housing. When it's social care and looking after elderly people, but also people who are disabled, it is the councils, not the NHS, predominantly, that support those residents. And councils are essential frontline services, intervening to protect our most vulnerable, but also keeping our villages, our towns and our cities the places where people want to live and bring up their families. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the financial situation that local government find themselves in, if it was represented in the NHS, if 10% of NHS trusts anticipated that they would have to declare themselves bankrupt in the next year, it would be on the front page of every single national newspaper. But when it comes to councils, there seems to be a situation of normalisation. Over the last 14 years, more councils have gone bankrupt than in the entire history of councils in this country. And as I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, the normalisation of that is very, very poor and needs attention. Councils do vital work protecting vulnerable people, especially young people, and that should be celebrated. But my council, like many other councils up and down the country, are now spending £8 in every 10 on social care, and some councils are spending up to half of their budgets on temporary accommodation. I will.
He referenced the spend on temporary accommodation, and this was one of the evidence we heard at the Select Committee. He may be aware that collectively London councils, 32 boroughs, are spending £4 million a day on temporary accommodation. Does he agree with me that this is just not sustainable?
I do agree with my honourable friend, the Chair of the Select Committee. It's not sustainable, but it's also bad for children. It's bad for families, it's bad for councils, and it's bad for communities. If children are in temporary accommodation, They genuinely don't know what school they're going to go to next term. And that's bad for children and the next generation of our citizens here. And that systematic change needs to be addressed. Central government needs to ease the burden on local authorities and spread out the load. Building enough affordable homes so that we don't see, as my honourable friend mentions, 354,000 people who are homeless every single night in England. Moving care into the community, as the Darcy report recommended, and resolving the systematic issues so that social care providers don't face funding crises every single year. And can I add my voice, my modest voice, to the calls of honourable members? Can the government please communicate the public health grant to local authorities so they can set budgets in a meaningful way this financial year? I will.
My honourable friend makes the argument very well about the amount of local government funding that has to go into adult social care. And these cuts that we saw under the Conservative government have hit disabled and older people particularly hard. So will my honourable friend agree with me that the uplift that we've seen in local government funding coming from the new Labour government will at least go some way to addressing those critical cuts that have happened to disabled people and to social care?
I thank my honourable friend, and also they recognise the contribution that she's made for that particular section of our society. I do agree, but there's far more that needs to happen. I know that the Minister is as ambitious as the rest of us to ensure that the 14 years of austerity is being addressed. Giving councils the funding that they need is a welcome change from the constant cuts under the last Conservatives, and it helps us address these emergencies in the short term. But it is also important that we have a government that accepts that the long-term systematic issues require transformation, that doesn't pretend that everything is fine, that things need to change. And government, local government, is faster, it's cheaper, it's more agile to deliver services on behalf of our communities and our citizens. And as I said earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is the best preventable service this country has. And I want to finish on this point, that the government's missions are missions that I, of course, and many Labour MPs back, but almost all of them run through local government. Whether it's safer streets, whether it's housing, whether it's social care and reforms to the NHS, it requires a confident, healthy local government sector that is able to deliver those services. As I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a vital first step, and I know the Minister, who has got exceptional experience in the sector and huge amounts of respect, also recognises that, and I look forward to seeing what comes next.
Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by drawing members' attentions to my role as the Chair of the Rural Services, APPG. The APPG is very concerned about the impact this settlement will have on rural local authorities and their ability to provide for their residents. Madam Deputy Speaker, it costs more money to provide services in rural areas due to a number of factors, including low population density, poor connectivity and larger distances to travel. But these facts are not reflected in the funding formula. Analysis by the Rural Services Network has shown that urban councils will receive 41% more per head than rural councils in government-funded spending power. Residents in rural areas now also pay, on average, 20% more in council tax than urban residents do. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the removal of the Rural Services Delivery Grant, which provided rural local authorities with £110 million extra to deliver those essential public services last year, will force rural councils to make yet more difficult financial decisions to be able to continue to provide those vital frontline services to their residents. The consultation stated that this grant failed to properly account for rural need and that funding must be allocated more effectively. However, the government has failed to follow up on this, and instead it has removed it a year early with no published evidence for its removal. This means that rural councils will have the lowest increase in core spending power between 2024-25 and 25-26. It's disappointing that the new recovery grant will be allocated mainly to urban councils. Now, we've heard across the House today, and I certainly do not want to make this an urban and rural debate, but the government must accept that there is real rural deprivation, and the continued underfunding of rural councils will have a negative impact on people's lives. My constituency of Glastonbury and Somerton is an example of this. Madam Deputy Speaker, Glastonbury Central is in the top 20 most deprived neighbourhoods in England, while a third of households in Street experience deprivation in at least one dimension, according to the 2021 census. Is it fair that because people live in a rural area, residents will have to pay more for less? Madam Deputy Speaker, let's take home-to-school transport as an example. The County Council's network research from 2018 showed that the average cost per head for home-to-school transport is a whopping £93 per child in rural areas, compared with just £10 per child in cities and towns. School transport for children with SEND cost Somerset Council £11.6 million in 2023, a 157% increase from 2018. The council also operates 283 routes per day for children with SEND. Now, as the council is rural, these routes are many miles long, taking longer and are much more expensive for children than in an urban environment, in some cases costing £1,650 per pupil per week. Or, Madam Deputy Speaker, we could take the increased risks Somerset faces from the devastating impacts of flooding. Somerset Council is the lead local flood authority responsible for managing flood risk from ordinary watercourses. Yet it does not have the sufficient staffing capacity to effectively deal with the constant risks that we face in Somerset, so often at the forefront of flooding and climate change. Only last week we suffered from immense flooding that forced over 100 residents from Primrose Hill Residential Park in Cheltenham near Somerton to be evacuated into emergency accommodation. While Martock, Blackford, Yeovilton, Podimore, Carey-Fitzpaine, Mudford and Bridgehampton suffered as a result of the flooding, with some completely cut off and unable to get to work, school or medical appointments. And indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, I visited or tried to visit some of these communities a week ago on Monday and saw for myself I couldn't get there, so people certainly couldn't get out. Madam Deputy Speaker, the lack of investment and proper repairs and maintenance by the previous Conservative-led County Council has left the infrastructure fragile and unable to cope, as gullies and ditches are blocked while culverts and drains have collapsed and are blocked. The funding model for local authorities is broken as it is, and Somerset Council, like many other councils, faces increased costs for social care and SEND provision. And so, as a result, investment is put on hold as budgets for other areas of Council's work continue to be placed under increasing pressure. So councils like Somerset, which face huge pressure from increased flooding, need ring-fenced funding allocations to be able to manage that flood risk, as council budgets simply cannot cope at the moment. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid that this financial assessment will fail to help rural local authorities such as Somerset cope with the increased challenges and demands that they face. The government must recognise the added pressure that rural areas face, and this must be recognised in any financial settlement. Thank you.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. It's an honour to speak in this debate. I just wanted to pick up on the comment from the member from North Cotswolds on the issue of auditors. We're all aware that the availability of auditors is spread pretty thinly, and that may in part contribute to the delays in getting accounts signed off. But in the context of the complexity of the local authority environments, in my own area, we have 2 unitary authorities with populations of less than 100,000 people. So I do commend this government for looking very seriously at a more sensible regime in terms of local government structure. But I do want to thank the local government minister. I really think we're very fortunate to have somebody with such experience and expertise in this area, and it's a real boon to have that, especially when we're embarking on such an ambitious and radical programme. So I thank him for that. But I also want to take the opportunity to welcome this year's local government finance settlement. Since 2010 to 2011, councils have been subject to steep funding cuts, and these cuts have disproportionately impacted the most deprived areas, with many authorities facing effective bankruptcy, putting essential services and jobs at risk. Councils in England have received a real terms cut in their core spending power of 15.9% since 2010-2011 compared to 25-26. Councils like Middlesbrough, in the special interest group of municipal authorities, have seen an average cut of 19.9%. And Middlesbrough itself has seen cuts worth 22%, a real terms cut of £55 million per year. That's around £835 per household. So that is why it is welcome that this year's settlement sees the provision nationally of more than £69 billion in funding overall, almost 7% cash terms increase, and more than a 4 terms real increase on the past year. But the government is on the right track in redirecting funding to areas in most need and with the greatest demand for services, who are often less able to raise income locally, as much as the Conservatives sort of pass the buck to local council increases. And the comments in the early discussion are not lost on anyone, that in an area like mine, many households are paying council tax at the rates of over £3,000 per annum more than is paid by Buckingham Palace in this city. So this is a fairer settlement for councils that would provide welcome relief to the most deprived areas. In Middlesbrough and Thornaby East, we very much welcome the settlement announced by the government and long overdue reforms to council funding. Middlesbrough Council is now in a position to invest more money in key services. And I welcome Mayor Chris Cook and the Labour Council and our new Chief Executive Eric Scollay establishing an over £4 million Middlesbrough Priorities Fund, and initiatives like Middlesbrough's Empty Home Strategy, which will use £6 million of government funding to purchase and refurbish empty homes for emergency accommodation. But while this is underway, many authorities continue to face a shortfall, and the Minister has been very candid that this is not a done deal. And we do very much look forward to the 3-year settlement later this year, because obviously councils are not going to be able to rely upon the additional funding being repeated, and that 3-year settlement, as colleagues have said across the House, gives councils that ability to plan much further ahead. So I hope we can extend our commitments to wider investment in our services on a longer-term basis through a fairer funding system that delivers long-term financial stability across all council services. And on the financial issues facing councils, we have raised the position of our wonderful councillors who do such a terrific job at very little reward, and who sometimes are on the receiving end of the ire of members of the public, sometimes justly, sometimes very unfairly and unkindly. So we do need to address that. But I certainly will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I should declare that I am a serving councillor in Rugby Borough Council. I'd just like to agree with him that councillors and council officers go out of their way to serve the public. And when they're trying to do so, despite 30 to 40% cumulative cuts, it is extremely difficult. And we need to remember that they are often trying to deliver services with one or both hands tied behind their back. And that's why the reforms that my right honourable friend is bringing forward are so important.
I couldn't agree with my honourable friend more, and I think it's incumbent upon everyone in politics to recognise the work of our local councils and treat them with the respect that they deserve. I'm afraid some of the comments that I've heard in recent times run contrary to that, and I've seen councillors in my area put in harm's way by the most careless and irresponsible comments from people in this House then they really ought to know better. But I just want to finish by raising the issue of not only the councils but the local government workforce and on the issue of pay. The Minister will be aware that local government workers have missed out on the higher wage settlements paid out to workers in other parts of the public sector in the past year, and overall seen 25% wiped from the value of their pay since 2010. And in drawing the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Interests, I note that Unison, GMB and Unite have said a substantial pay award for local government staff is essential. So I do ask the Minister to take steps to address those concerns and look to the upcoming spending review to deliver the finances and provide a £15 minimum hourly rate for those workers who've served us so incredibly well. And I think of the COVID days of maintaining those public services, that they should be properly compensated for the work that they do is long, long overdue. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on behalf of my constituents across Keighley, Ilkley, Silsden, Craven, the Worth Valley and indeed my wider constituency area. And there's a specific part of the government's announcement today that I really want to focus on, and that is our real frustration around the fact that all of my constituents are going to have to now face, as a result of a decision made by this government, a 9.9% increase in their council tax. And this comes as a result of a request that was put forward by our Labour administration who run Bradford Council for a 15% increase in council tax. And yet the government have decided to instigate a 9.9% increase without any opportunity for a referendum to be held to give my constituents the choice on whether or not they deem it reasonable for this government to award a 9.9% increase in council tax. So the government, this Labour government, has made a choice to impose a significant council tax increase on hard-working families, not only across my constituency, but indeed across the wider Bradford district. And I will give way to my honourable neighbour, the member for Shipley, and I hope that she will join me in her intervention in agreeing with me in opposing this council tax rise. I will give way.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. As he well knows, it is the cuts that were made by the party opposite when in government to local government through the grant that hit councils like Bradford District, and we've heard from other honourable members who were hit hardest. And that's why Bradford Council were pushed into exceptional financing, have had to borrow and have had no choice but to put up council tax. And even with this council tax rise, it will still be below average. Does he agree with my assessment?
Well, I'm very pleased to see that my honourable member, the member for Shipley, has been given her Labour whip handout note, because it's really interesting. Not once did I hear her oppose the Labour government's increase in council tax. But not only that, did the honourable member not call out the mismanagement of the Labour-controlled authority. And when I refer to mismanagement, I refer to a whopping £50 million that has been spent of taxpayers' money on Bradford Live, a music venue that was promised to open for District of Culture, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have been awarded City of Culture in Bradford District, but I refer to it as District of Culture because that money should be benefiting all of the constituents across the Bradford District. This is a music venue, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was estimated to cost around £25 million, but indeed Labour councillors signed off an expenditure of £50 million. It's not even open yet to the public, despite City of Culture happening. And not only that, I won't give way, because I don't think that the Honourable Member for Shipley is going to agree with me, and indeed many of the constituents across the Bradford District, in opposing a nearly 10% increase in council tax, and I hope that her constituents are watching. And not only that, Madam Deputy Speaker, it comes down to the absolute mismanagement of children's services by Bradford Council. Let's not forget that the government, the last previous Conservative government, had to step in and take children's services off Bradford Council because not only one damning Ofsted report, but multiple damning Ofsted reports indicated that it wasn't through the fault of those who were providing children's services and the children's level of care that was needed at the ground that were failing, but indeed the management and the disconnect in the management at the very top of Bradford Council was so bad, failing our children, that the government had to step in and set up a children's trust, which I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is now having benefit. And isn't it ironic that the Labour government will refer to 14 years, but in 2021, the Labour administration at Bradford Council submitted, as part of their statutory duty, a report stating, and I quote, that the council were in sound financial position in 2021. But yet now they are claiming that they are £150 million in debt and seeking a council tax increase of 9.9%, despite having requested a 15% increase. So what on earth is this government doing to hold local authorities to account who are failing constituents in delivering a level of services? Where on earth is that accountability, Madam Deputy Speaker? And it's not only Bradford Live that a huge amount of taxpayers' money has been misspent on, but One City Park in the centre of Bradford. Car parks are being knocked down. This is not the job of a local authority. We should be relying on private sector inward investment coming in to deal with regeneration projects. The job of a local authority is to focus on providing statutory-based services, not dipping in and out of regeneration schemes and failing to do that at the cost of my constituents. And now we see, Madam Deputy Speaker, through City of Culture or District of Culture, that doesn't seem to be benefiting many of my constituents, the council wanting to have a fancy art project being constructed in Centenary Project. Who on earth is benefiting across the Keighley and Ilkley constituency as a result of this? I will give way.
I'm grateful. As ever, my honourable friend is doing an excellent job standing up for his constituents in Keighley and Ilkley and exposing the failures of the Labour-controlled Bradford Council. In Scotland, this finance settlement will not affect my council, but my council is having to deal with a £265 million, along with all the other councils in Scotland, a £265 million hit because of the national insurance arise imposed by the government opposite. So as well as all the mismanagement by Bradford Council, does he agree with me that many local authorities across the UK are having to take money away from vital services to fund this tax hike by the Labour government?
I absolutely agree with this point that has been made not only by my right honourable friend, but indeed many members on this side of the House, that the government may issue tax to be finance to be instigated down to local governments, but they're taking it off, on the other hand, through tax, through employers' national insurance. So, a classic socialist policy: take from one hand and we'll tell you how you're going to spend it in the other. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, not only is my constituents now going to be exposed to an increase of just about 10% in council tax, without the opportunity for a referendum to decide, but they're also experiencing vast cuts to local services. We've had the two household waste and recycling centres close in my constituency. The council are selling off assets. There are assets that are not yet being absolutely protected, despite warm words coming out from our Labour local authority, like the Ilkley Lido, Keighley Market in the centre of Keighley, and indeed shops are now being looked at being disposed of in Keighley, creating added worry to many of those occupants of those shops that the council own. We've seen parking charges rise in villages like Addingham, where the shops who need those people to come and shop and benefit that local income are now facing much detrimental impact. So where does the issue of fairness kick in? When my constituents see their local council rise council tax, but yet spend their hard-working council tax on a huge amount of mismanagement projects, wastage projects, and projects that aren't even open. And then, Madam Deputy Speaker, I did a Freedom of Information request to find out if my constituents were getting a fair level of spending in the constituency of Keighley and Ilkley, and I asked about highway spending. I asked the local authority how much of money has been spent on highways in my constituency over a two-year period. Now, there are 5 constituencies across the Bradford district, so you would expect the figure to be about 20%. But no, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was about 7% on average over a two-year period. No wonder the state of potholes in my constituency are far worse than, indeed, the inner city centre of Bradford. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, how can I justify backing any increase in council tax when the spending is so dire? And then I want to come back to the issue of accountability. The last Chief Executive, Kirsten England, of Bradford Council, held the post of being Chief Executive for a long period of time, oversaw the mismanagement of finance, oversaw the diabolical handling under her watch of children's services before the last Conservative government stepped in. But jobs for the boys, Madam Deputy Speaker. What is Kirsten England now doing? She's now chairing City of Culture. Absolute disgrace in terms of where the accountability is being held by this government. So I just want to use this opportunity to quote some of the concerns that have been raised to me by my constituents as a result of council tax being raised by 9.9%. And I'll read some of them out, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will be 70 next year, and I am still having to continue to work to make ends meet. Another one, I am disabled, and now as a result of this council tax hike, I will have to use my own savings to look after myself. Another, I'm a single mother with 3 children and I simply cannot afford this. Another, I didn't ask the council to throw money at a concert venue that is not open, something that's not benefiting my constituents. And yet they have done that and expecting me to pay the price. And another, it's difficult to see why I would like to live through my retirement having to spend this much more. And the list goes on. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is only one solution long-term for this, and I'll be interested to see what the government has to say. I have been long campaigning to separate my constituency, and indeed under the previous Member of Parliament, Philip Davies, for the member for Shipley, to pull our 2 constituencies out of Bradford Council and create our own unitary authority away from the mismanagement of Bradford City itself. And on that point, I will give way to the honourable member for Shipley.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and as he knows, he and my predecessor tried to put this to his own government, who rejected the idea as a complete non-starter. The idea of the breakaway council, let's work together across Bradford for the benefit of all of our constituents.
Interesting to see what the honourable member for Shipley's constituents say, but indeed she has quoted the previous administration completely wrong, because they were absolutely behind the campaign to split the 2 constituencies apart. Indeed, I had many a meeting with the Boundary Commission. The challenge is you have to get consent from the local authority. And we have a Labour-controlled authority who will not go anywhere near this campaign. Why? Because they know that my constituents are effectively the cash cow for the rest of Bradford. We are the absolute dominant contributor to council tax, to business rates that are feeding city centre projects in the centre of Bradford. So I would like to understand what the current government's position is on my campaign to separate my constituency, and indeed I believe I speak on behalf of many constituents within the Shipley constituency, to pull those two areas out and away from Bradford Council so we can have our own unitary authority. We can spend our own council tax, our own business rates in our own area, make sure that our local priorities are indeed prioritised, and then leave Bradford City to make those decisions. And it'd be interesting to see what the Minister has to say on that in his summing up, because that is the only way of achieving a long-term solution for my constituents across Keighley, Ilkley, Silsden, the Worth Valley and indeed the wider constituency that I represent. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Gareth Snell.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, how on earth does one follow that? I just wish the honourable gentleman for Keighley and Ilkley had spoken up so we could all hear him. What I would like to respond to him, though, because he's made points about councils raising council tax, selling assets, cutting services. Does he believe that's happened to Bradford in isolation? Does he believe he is the only council that has looked at their service and their budget and gone, this is tough? Because what he's actually described is 8 years of Conservative rule in Stoke-on-Trent, where council tax went up 8 years out of 8, where town halls were closed and put up for fire sales, where children's services were on the brink and there was a record number of children in care. What he has described is a face that every council faced, and the predominant reason was because his party in government took the scissors to the budgets, slashed the services that we all had, and decided that actually they knew better. So whilst he may make a fiery speech in this place for his social media clips, perhaps what he needs to do is not worry about taking, no, I won't give way. We've heard plenty from the honourable gentleman in the last 7 or so minutes. What he needs to think about is less about detaching his constituency from Bradford and more about reattaching himself to reality of the situation that he put us all in. On that point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to welcome the fact that Stoke-on-Trent City Council has received £8 million under the recovery grant. I've listened with great interest, particularly to the Honourable Lady from Glastonbury and Somerton and the gentleman from Wokingham, about the impact this has on rural services grants. I go back to the same point that I raised, that we have to move ourselves away from this confected top trumps that the Conservatives wanted us to have, that deprivation in Stoke-on-Trent is somehow in competition with the needs of rural communities. And I think what the government's trajectory has set out with a fair funding review and looking at how and why we end up with the funding settlements that we have will take us towards that place. I know it's not going to be immediate, and I fully accept that there are always winners and losers in everything. But my city is one of the 5 poorest cities in the country. 90% of our council, 90% of our homes in my city are Band A. Every time we raise council tax by 4.99%, it raises less proportionally than when my neighbouring 2 district council authorities and the county council raised by 4.99%. So not only are we not getting the benefit of having bands B through E's, but we also are seeing the difference between what is paid in neighbouring authorities grow every year. And that, again, is simply unfair and a system that nobody, I think, would design in particular. What I wanted to talk about very briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, is over the period between... I was first elected to a council in 2010. In fact, the honourable gentleman was the peer mentor appointed to my council by the then LGA. It's why I'm here and not running a council, I suppose, is one argument. We were shown the jaws of doom graph that demonstrated just how challenging financing was going to be over the next decade, and the predictions that my party made then have turned out to be true. Had the last government frozen in cash terms, so no uprates, no decreases, in cash terms alone, the amount of money we were receiving in 2010 and kept it at that rate until 2024, we would have had £411 million to spend on various projects. Instead, we lost that money And then we had this perverse idea that suddenly we had to start bidding to get some of that money back through a levelling up fund. If we'd had £411 million over that 10 years, the economic regeneration of my towns and city centres would have happened. It wouldn't have had to come, we wouldn't have had to come cap in hand to a government to ask for capital funding to build a car park or to build a new hotel, because we would have simply done the things that we needed to do over time in a way that fitted with the other projects that we were seeking to deliver. Instead, we didn't have that. We got levelling up, which in my city was basically a car park that now actually costs the council more money than it raises because of where it is and how many people use it. And we should learn from those lessons, because actually I welcome every penny that I get given to my city by every department. And you know, the DFG money that was announced by the health department is really helpful, but the council administers that to keep people safe in their homes. They don't end up in A&E, and there are things around how we join up public spending in total place-based funding that means we can get and drive those efficiencies and those productivity gains that actually will make the system as public sector provisions much better. So when we are looking at the funding for local government, I would urge the Minister, as part of the next phase of this, to think about how we stop this shuffling of wooden dollars, how we, as my honourable friend from Telford said, it's local authorities that provide the youth clubs that stop young people going into crime and antisocial behaviour, which then costs much more through the criminal justice system later on. It is local authorities that do the checks on houses to make sure they're safe and decent so that people don't end up in A&E because they've lived in cold, damp houses. It is local authorities who make sure that the restaurants we go to are meeting the food hygiene standards that we want and that the products we buy are being checked by trading standards. These are services that keep us safe and well and actually end up preventing much greater costs further on to the public sector. So how we fund the public sector in total place has to be a way that this government moves. And I want to end, Madam Deputy Speaker, my short contribution to this debate by saying we received today in Staffordshire the letter that the Honourable Gentleman sent about reorganisation and devolution. Reorganisation in Staffordshire could be a long, drawn-out process because basically no one can agree with anything. We all want to pretend we like each other, but the secret is we don't. And the comments from council leaders and other MPs in Staffordshire about Stoke-on-Trent, some of the things they've said have been appalling. We are a lovely place and we want to work with everybody. We will end up undoubtedly in some form of North Staffordshire combined authority that logically makes sense economically, geographically, socially. It is where people live, work and enjoy. So could I say to the Minister that as what is inviting those new proposals from local authorities, where there is an appetite, but there is one or two councils holding out because they're more interested in protecting their own job as leader than they are about protecting the jobs of the people that we represent, that they move at pace and they make it quite clear that we will not wait for them, because my constituency and my constituents deserve the same level of investment that goes into the West Midlands, the East Midlands, Manchester and Liverpool combined authority regions. Without that, we get further left behind. And my constituency, as I said, is the 5th poorest in England. I do not want to be standing here after the next election and saying that my constituency is still the 5th poorest in England. And I hope with this government we can make sure it isn't.
Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to start by welcoming some aspects of what the Minister is proposing, because I think it's important to not always be firing political shots at each other, to look at the common ground, to give credits where it's due and so forth. And so I have said this to the Minister before, actually. I really do welcome the moves that the government is making towards multi-year funding settlements, so important, away from the hand-to-mouth, year-to-year approach to funding, and also away from the jam jar approach to funding, particularly capital funding, which has been so damaging, that ridiculous competition between authorities over an ever-decreasing pot of funding. So those are really, really things to welcome. But there are some buts, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are quite a few buts, actually, about the local government finance settlement, but I'm going to focus just on 3 today. I represent the constituency of North Herefordshire, wonderful constituency. Herefordshire Council has received a settlement that is well below the national average, well below the average for comparator councils, and well below what is needed to provide the services that residents need and deserve. We've had an interesting element of debate earlier here, with some seeking to pose a binary kind of conflict between rural and urban authorities. I want to get away from that. That's really, really unhelpful. But it is important, I think, to recognise that there is deprivation in rural areas, serious deprivation in rural areas. There is deprivation that isn't just about income, but is also about access to services. The Honourable Member for Somerton and for Glastonbury and Somerton talked very eloquently about this, the fact that sparse populations, long distances, poor transport networks all significantly, hugely increase the cost of delivering services, whether it's social care or home-to-school transport. And that's the impact of geography. Demography is also an issue too. In Herefordshire, we've got 50% more over 65s than the national average, and that has a knock-on impact on the costs of delivering services, those crucial services by local government. So it is absolutely crystal clear that while the government has taken away the Rural Services Delivery Grant, which perhaps it viewed as yet another jam jar, it hasn't replaced it with a fair allocation of funding on the basis of rurality in the new formula. So can I please beg the Minister to really revisit this issue when he's coming up with the multi-year funding settlement, because otherwise there really will be a very serious problem of rural areas having their specific elements of deprivation under-recognised in the funding formula, and that is going to, build up so many problems into the future. So I can see the Minister nodding. I thank him for that, and I warmly invite him to come to Herefordshire so we can show him face-to-face on the ground exactly those challenges of providing those services. That was but number one, Madam Deputy Speaker, regarding rurality. But number two has also been referenced before in this debate, and it relates to the impact of the employer national insurance contributions rise. And I do appreciate the nuance with which the Minister answered questions on this earlier, and his recognition that this is a really serious issue and that the funding settlement does not fully acknowledge that, particularly the on-costs, because so much of what local authorities do is not just the staff that they employ themselves, but the commissioned services. And I'm sure, like members across the House, we have been inundated with correspondence from charities and indeed businesses working in sectors such as the care sector, who are desperately worried about the effect of the employer national insurance contributions increases on their ability to provide those crucial services to local people, so often commissioned by local authorities. Please, when he's doing the multi-year funding formula in future years, will he address that and ensure that those costs are fully integrated into the calculation? And, Madam Deputy Speaker, my third but, which again has been touched on earlier, and I hope the Minister expressed doubt about whether there could be cross-party agreement reached on this matter, but there seems to be quite a degree of consensus across this House that council tax is a broken tax. It's a broken funding system. It is outdated, it's regressive, it's unfair, it's way overdue for a review. Charging people based on an assessment of property rates that was set 35 years ago, which has never been updated. It's crying out for a fundamental review. So will the Minister please commit to undertaking that review, to working cross-party across the House, to find a much fairer and more sustainable long-term approach to raising local funding? Thank you.
Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I open by drawing the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Interest as an unpaid Parliamentary Vice President of the Local Government Association. It's been an excellent debate, and I do applaud the many members on all sides who've made insightful contributions to the discussion and have brought up issues not just affecting their own constituency, as the member, for example, for Keighley and Ilkley so powerfully set out in his speech, but also for those like the member for North Cotswolds, who in his capacity as chair of the Public Accounts Committee set out a number of the really important points, which I'm glad the Minister touched on in his introduction, that will affect the detail of how this plays out at local level. The House knows that local government in the UK spends around £40 billion worth of taxpayers' money on over 800 different services delivered by the average local authority. As a consequence, this touches the lives of more constituents than almost any other area of government activity. And the starting point we have to recognise is the point that was made by the chairman of the County Councils Network when he said, from the perspective of local authorities, this was the worst settlement in years. Now, I know the Minister, from his introduction, is clearly a Minister who knows his wocat from his burb, from his persnuffle. But it's the impact of that detail that matters so much. In particular, the most significant element, which is the imposition of the employer's national insurance contribution in the budget. More than £1 billion in unfunded costs faced by local authorities alone from that, according to the estimates of the Local Government Association. If we consider a council like Harlow that sets out that this settlement represents a 21% cut in their core funding, within which they will receive £198,000 of revenue support this year only, for over £1 million of additional direct costs of national insurance contributions, a cost that will rise to £1.2 million next year, with, as currently projected, no funding provided at all. And as the Institute for Government sets out in its analysis of the government's budget overall, when it looks at those elements affecting local government, they say that the budget is heavily front-loaded, there is additional funding this year, but that the current plans set out by the Chancellor imply that there will be cuts in every year for the remainder of the Parliament, which will, to quote the Institute for Government, make it very difficult for local government to improve. So we need to recognise, Madam Deputy Speaker, that whilst there will be winners and there will be losers, this is a budget settlement for local government that contains an enormous number of challenges. And there remain a number of very significant questions, which I will come to in a moment. I'd like to welcome the point that's been made by a number of members about the value we place on our local councillors. I know I've spoken to the Minister. I agree with the point raised by a number of members about restoring the access of councillors in England to the local government pension scheme. We need to demonstrate the value that we place on local leadership. It will be even more significant in the context of extensive local government reform. I know that it's something ministers are considering. We know that the cost of it is minimal in the context of overall local government finance settlement. But so many members have raised the point that ensuring that local leadership and motivating that local leadership is vital to getting that right. And of course, there is the risk with the reduction in the number of councillors, the reduction in the number of local politicians in a country whose population is projected to hit 72.5 million by 2032. That we need to make sure that that growing democratic deficit is addressed by engaged, effective local politicians with the ability to make decisions in their area. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, let's look at where this money is going and then turn to where this money is coming from and how that is changed. As the Minister knows, around 3/4 of council funding is spent on social care. And since, in particular, the fair access criteria that were introduced by the last Labour government, that is no longer a matter of local decision-making. It is largely a statutory duty where there are very clear rules set out in guidance from central government about how that money will be spent and how each resident, each constituent seeking help will be treated. So as a consequence, the bulk of the funding that is going into the system is being spent on what we might describe as the must-dos rather than the nice-to-haves, the fulfilment of clearly defined statutory duties. And when we cast our minds back to the last local government report of this nature under the previous Labour government, we see a very much longer report than the one that's before the House this evening that sets out the relative needs formula, which was the methodology that was used for the distribution of funding for all manner of different areas of local government activity. And in 2010, around 25% of local government resources came from the council tax, 27% came from formula grant, which essentially was a redistribution of business rates, and then 48%, very nearly half, from specific grants, of which around 2/3 was the education budget. And of course, one of the big changes that's taken place over that period is the growth in the independence of schools, the rise of academies, and therefore a much larger share of that funding no longer sits within the local authority budget. It is paid by the Education and Skills Funding Agency direct to schools. So whilst that funding is no longer part of the council's budget, it is still being spent locally on the same services that it always was. A lot of the debate in the House around local government has been about devolution. And one of the most significant areas of devolution is around financial responsibility. If we reflect on those same formula elements today, 52% of council spending is derived from council tax, directly under local control. 27% from a grown share of business rates pooling, with a focus on incentivising councils to deliver growth. And a much lower 22% from grant funding, as government has sought to give local authorities over that 14-year period a much greater degree of control over their own resources. And when we reflect on what that formula also tells us, there's a number of members have made the point that the decision to scrap things like the Rural Services Grant reflects criticism of priorities set out by the previous government. We also need to reflect that when we look at the list of the lowest funded councils in 1997, the lowest funded councils in 2010, and the lowest funded councils today, we find broadly the same set of local authorities on that list. The consequence of that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is very clear. No government can cut funding that the council didn't have in the first place. And whilst most Conservative and particularly rural authorities didn't see any benefit or significant benefit in funding through the multiple different indices of deprivation, it has been clear that that Conservative government for those 14 years, for the most part, maintained a significant premium of funding going to areas through things like the funding for children who were on free school meals, going into education, and by ensuring that deprivation formula continued to play a significant part in the distribution of social care resources. And things like the Rural Services Grant were a small step towards making sure that places that had never seen any benefit from any government began to have some of the additional costs that they faced recognised in the way that local government funding was distributed. And we've heard a number of members across the House, particularly new members on the benches opposite, newly elected to rural areas, saying how awful it is that their local authorities are challenged by the cost of things like potholes and maintaining rural roads. Well, wait till they find out who decided to take away the Rural Services Grant, so they would no longer have the resources to deal with that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that the biggest challenge that all local authorities face is going to be dealing in parallel with reorganisation and the very tight financial environment that they are going to face. As my colleague, the member for Thirsk and Malton, said earlier on in the statement on this matter, it's clear, and I respect the fact that the government have been very clear about this in their statements to this House, that they've made a decision in Whitehall about the form they expect to see local government in England taking, and that they will ensure that that is implemented, initially through local authorities coming forward as volunteers, and then subsequently through a statutory invitation to ensure that people do. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the Minister, in summing up, will address a number of those points. We know that tonight's report is principally about the revenue support grant. Local authorities don't yet know where they stand on the public health grant. They don't yet clearly know where they stand on schools funding. They don't yet clearly know the impact of government announcements on the housing revenue account, the parking revenue account, all of which will have a significant impact, and in particular, the statutory override on the dedicated schools grant for SEND, which remains uncertain and a very significant budget pressure. But let me finish where the member for Thirsk and Malton finished. If the government can find £18 billion to cover the cost of the Chagos Islands deal, then I'm sure they can find the funds to make a better fist of it for our local authorities.
Mr. Rushnara Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to close this debate, and I'd like to begin by thanking honourable members on all sides of the House for their important contributions today. And I also want to pay tribute to the dedicated public servants working in local government across the country for everything they do to deliver for their communities by providing essential local services, protecting the most vulnerable in our society and helping lay the foundations for a good life for working people. They are doing this with great resilience in the face of significant challenges over 14 years of chaos, underinvestment and decline. Turning the page on the many challenges we've inherited won't be easy, But the settlement we've discussed today, as my honourable friend, the Minister for Local Government, has said, is a significant step towards rebuilding local government as we rebuild Britain. Public service is our collective duty, and we are very grateful to those who contributed to the consultation on the provisional settlement and to the members who made representations. Their input is vital because strong, empowered local government is central to our plan for change, to delivering the higher growth and higher living standards that every community deserves. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the change, the national renewal that this Labour government was elected to deliver. And we will achieve this by getting local government back on its feet and working with us in the spirit of true partnership. We are fundamentally resetting the relationship between central and local government by delivering the greatest transfer of power from Whitehall to our communities in a generation through our landmark English devolution white paper. And crucially, we are fixing the foundations of local government, starting with the broken funding system that's left many councils of all stripes in crisis. The final settlement does what is needed, providing a 6.8% cash terms increase in council's core spending power, bringing total spending for the sector to over £69 billion for 2025-26, as my honourable friend stated. With the settlement and the budget taken together, delivering over £5 billion of new funding for local services over and above council tax income. We are ending the wasteful and costly bidding wars for funding pots local councils have had to endure and moving towards secure multi-year financial settlements. With more money for local social care, increased funding for special education needs and disabilities and alternative provision, and a £600 million recovery grant to support councils with the greatest need. We are responding, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the drivers of costs that we know are putting authorities under huge pressure. It is clear there's much more to do, but this settlement marks a turning point for local government after years of neglect and failure. Many honourable members have raised important questions today about how this impacts on local authorities in their constituencies. My honourable friend, the Minister, has already addressed those points by responding as we've gone along, but I will respond to some of the other points that were made. But before I do that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to remind the House and the right honourable member who is the Public Accounts Chair, who's distinguished in his work, will know this. The National Audit Office has previously published figures and with their most recent publication in 2021 reported that core spending power was 26% lower in 2010 to 2021. That's what happened, over recent years. We had a reduction in terms of the investment in local authorities. So turning that around is going to require time. Unfortunately, the comments we heard from the Shadow Minister in his opening remarks beggars belief, frankly. It's as if we didn't have 14 years of Conservative government, and as if within the space of 7 years we can fix the mess that they left behind with record levels of cuts and record levels of underinvestment. So we will not take lectures from a government that consistently failed local government up and down the country and decimated public services. That's the mess that we have inherited and working hard to fix. Now, we will work across party where people are serious about tackling the root causes, but we will not tolerate the hypocrisy and complete denial of the failure of the last 14 years. That's the mess we're trying to correct and fix. Madam Deputy Speaker, on funding, Investment in rural areas has gone up by 6%. Urban areas, just 7%. We are investing. Perhaps he will listen. The Minister tried to, by the way, respond to his comments. He wasn't interested. He wasn't interested in his answers. So he will sit down and listen to my closing remarks. I want to make sure I respond to honourable members across the House who have taken these issues very seriously, and I want to respond to them. Madam Deputy Speaker, so on social care, this government has already invested £3.7 billion increase in social care. We have recognised the need for investment in response to addressing the national insurance contribution. That's over up by 515 billion, as my honourable friend has pointed out. £1 billion in SEND. 600 million in the recovery fund. That's a snapshot of the investment we are putting in because local government and local services have been starved of much needed support under the last government. That's what we're trying to correct. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to turn to the Shadow Minister, and the Speaker has had his chance to make his points. It's my turn to sum up. And I want to make sure I address the points that have been made. He has had his chance to make his point. He should have taken the opportunity to take the response from the Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the other points that the Shadow Minister in his opening remark raised and other members raised on rural funding, this government is absolutely committed to tackling the issues that matter to rural communities. Places with significant rural populations will, on average, receive, as I said, almost 6% increase in core spending power next year, which is a real terms increase. No council will see a reduction. My honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, raised a number of important points in relation to temporary accommodation and SEND funding, among other points. The final settlement for the new Children's Social Care Prevention Grant is worth £270 million. She works tirelessly in her committee on raising many issues, including around homelessness and rough sleeping. We have already increased the investment to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping by £233 million, taking the total funding to nearly £1 billion. She raised the important points around local housing allowance. We are focused on making sure we can increase the availability of housing and tackle the long-term underinvestment in house building. That is why this government is determined to make sure we build the 1.5 million high-quality homes. That we have also invested £500 million to provide to the Affordable Homes programme, because we recognise that there's been chronic underinvestment in social and affordable homes, home building and provision of housing in the last 14 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, the member for Woking raised a number of points in relation to social care, which I have addressed, as well as on national insurance. My honourable friend, the member for Sheffield and South East, raised important points about investment, about SEND, which I have addressed. The honourable member and the chairman of the Select Committee, Public Accounts Committee, made a very, very thoughtful, considered speech. I've addressed a number of the points you made in relation to the rural grants delivery, and he made a very important point about local audits. It is a scandal that local authorities, a number of local authorities, haven't been able to provide the appropriate audits, and my honourable friend, the Minister, is working closely with the local authorities to ensure that happens. Sadly, another legacy that we have inherited, but we are determined to work with colleagues, including the Honourable Member, the Chairman, he's not a Casey, but he's a great expertise in terms of his work, that we tackle these issues. These are the sort of issues that we are having to address, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are determined to address them. The Honourable Member, my honourable friend, the Member for Telford, raised also issues around social care, a massive challenge that we are determined to tackle in the coming years, and already investing funding into social care and supporting local authorities that have been struggling. The Honourable Member for Glastonbury and Somerset raised a number of points, including the point in relation to home school transport, and we are aware that home to school transport costs are increasing significantly, and in large part due to the pressures in the SEND system, and we're committing to addressing those challenges in the SEND system. The Honourable Member for Herefordshire, North Herefordshire, raised a number of points, including really important points. The consultation on the multi-year settlement ends on the 12th of February, and I would welcome her and other honourable members to make their contribution and their views heard as part of that consultation. We are very serious about working with colleagues, both in Parliament, in our Parliament, and in local areas, to tackle these very serious challenges that local authorities need us to address 14 years after 14 years of underinvestment. So these are major challenges we've got to address, major challenges. I am concluding my speech. The Honourable Member has had the chance to do so. This is a concluding statement. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable member raised. He had the opportunity to make his speech. I'm sure he will get his clips on Facebook and Twitter, and he doesn't need to continue in that vein. He will be.
John Lamont.
Madam Deputy Speaker, please indulge me, but could you give some guidance under the standing orders as to how we can encourage ministers to debate? This is, after all, a debating chamber. Either minister is unable or unwilling to debate with honourable and right honourable members.
The honourable gentleman will know full well that that was not a point of order, and it is at the minister's discretion whether she wishes to take an intervention or not. But I'm sure she's coming to her closing remarks. Rushnara Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Once again, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank honourable members for their valuable contributions. Even if we don't always agree on them, the point is we can all agree that there is much work that needs to be done to ensure local authorities, local government. I give way to the honourable.
I am really grateful for the Minister for giving way, because I'm about to raise a really important point that hasn't yet been addressed in this whole debate, and it's this. A lot of councils are seeing their reserves diminished hugely, and I worry that there are a lot more councils in the pipeline that might well be under a Section 114 agreement. So will she commit tonight to her department working ever more closely with those councils to try and present them getting into that situation? Because as the point I made in my speech, once we get into that situation, it's always more expensive for council taxpayers, and they do get cuts in their services.
An exemplar contribution from the honourable member, and absolutely right. The points he makes about making sure that local authorities receive the expertise and support, and that's why the local audit office is really important. And I know my honourable friend will work with him and his committee in making sure that we get this right, so that local authorities get the right support in order to ensure that their finances are carefully managed. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank, as I said, honourable members once again for their valuable contributions. As I hope it has been clear throughout the course of this debate, this government is under no illusion about the scale of the challenges before us. There is no silver bullet to solve them. After 14 years, the idea that within the space of 7 months, all of those underlying issues can be resolved is for the birds. And I hope that honourable members, including the shadow government, recognise that we have to take these issues seriously. Just turning up, making scoring points is not going to do the job. We have to make sure we recognise that there are serious issues and challenges, and where we can work together, we must. And I'm conscious that I didn't give way to the Shadow Minister, and I'm very happy on that note. If he wants to work with us, very happy to give way.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. As I think certainly most of us on these benches, and it was acknowledged with gentle humour from a number of colleagues, are determined that we do work together in a constructive way, because we recognise that this has a huge impact. But I have to just ask the Minister the question. She referred to an investment of £538 million in respect of national insurance contributions. Does she really argue that it is an investment to raise taxes on one group of people in order to give a grant in order to pay another government tax by our local authorities? Wouldn't it surely be better to go for a lower tax, higher growth agenda rather than seek to tax our way into prosperity, which doesn't have the best track record in economic history?
Perhaps the Shadow Minister didn't hear my honourable friend in his opening remark, as well as my opening remarks, about what this government has already invested in local government. Billions more. I mean, does he want me to go over this again? There isn't much time, Madam Deputy Speaker. I suggest he goes back and listens to the speech and listens to the announcements. He knows that we have invested, under difficult circumstances, additional £5 billion into local government in a very challenging set of circumstances. So I very much hope that we can work on areas where we can agree on, and where we don't, let's agree to disagree. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, there is no silver bullet to solve the challenges that we have to address. Many we have inherited. Today is the start, not the end, of the process of reform and renewal. But this government, with this settlement, we have begun the task of putting councils on a sound financial footing, fixing the foundations and strengthening the sector for the long term. This will give councils the certainty and stability they need to plan, move from crisis management to prevention, and deliver the change this country needs: higher growth, higher living standards, more jobs, more homes and opportunities as we rebuild as part of our plan for change, putting more money in people's pockets, putting stability, investment and reform first to deliver national renewal, putting government back in the service of working people. I commend this settlement to the House.
The question is the motion on the local government finance report as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the second motion on local government finance formally. The question is the motion on referendums relating to council tax increases as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.